Which was the first country to commit to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050? Which country has the largest offshore wind capacity and will build 40 gigawatts of offshore wind power by 2030? Who has attracted a record number of offshore wind investments? Where can you find the world's largest wind farms and the first commercial floating wind farm? Which country is analysing the science of the wind and the seas? Designing and building the future of offshore wind. Where will you find a workforce with 20 years of industry experience? With operations and maintenance skills established on more than 40 operational wind farms. Who has hundreds of years of marine expertise? Which government is collaborating with industry and has a £1 billion net zero innovation portfolio to develop tomorrow's green energy solutions today? We're the UK, and we're ready to trade with you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Wood. I'm the British ambassador in Norway, and part of my role is as energy and climate champion for the whole of the Nordic Baltic region. And what that means is trying to coordinate a little around our region, which is full of innovation and full of development and opportunity, and to look for synergies and really push the effort of collaborating with this region. Now, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution in the UK is a blueprint to decarbonise the whole of the UK economy. It sets out the sectors where we need to make progress and where the government will provide support and partnership with industry and academia. Hydrogen is absolutely key to the 10-point plan. It has the potential to provide cleaner energy across industry, transport, and even heating our homes. So in April last year, the UK released its hydrogen strategy with clear steps to achieve our ambition, which is to produce 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen by 2030. Our green transition is focused on reaching our net zero goals, but also on creating real economic benefits from a sustainable green economy. The effort on hydrogen will create challenges and opportunities in organization, from organizing development, demand, supply, and transmission. And it will also create challenges for a variety of actors, from researchers, technology providers, energy companies, innovators, and investors. with, we believe, also a clear role for government in bringing all of these actors together. So we'll hear about some of that today. It also requires a lot of collaboration across borders. The whole of our Nordic Baltic region is on the same journey as the UK. It's a very innovative region, as I said, rich in history of development in energy, research, tech, and engineering. And I believe there is much to learn from each other and much to be gained by joining forces together on the journey to industrial scale hydrogen. So I'm particularly happy to see so many people signed up today to share experiences and to build connections, importantly, from the UK and the Nordic Baltic region. And I know you're going to, I was just listening to some of the chat before you all came into the room, and I know you're going to hear some enlightening presentations and some very lively panel discussions. So I wish you very fruitful participation in this event. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this UK Baltic Hydrogen Conference. Thank you very much for those kind words, Richard, in introducing this event. I'm delighted to be here today as moderator of this particular event, and I'm really pleased that so many people have joined this particular event today. I believe that we have many hundreds of subscribers to the event. It's going to be a fabulous day. We're looking at a number of critical issues in relation to the development of the hydrogen economy. From my perspective, I chair the UK's Northwest Hydrogen Alliance. I argue in much of the work that we do that we're absolutely ready and ambitious to take advantage of the opportunities that the hydrogen economy offers us. We have over 40 members, molecule producers, distributors, consumers, innovators, skills providers. And we've been very much working on the whole sort of supply demand aspects of hydrogen, which will be one of the key issues in terms of driving things forward and developing the hydrogen initiative. And that then gives me the opportunity, I think, to sort of introduce this particular session, which will be looking at some of those issues. We've got a couple of speakers, and I'll introduce them in a second. And then we're going to have a nice panel discussion, a debate and deliberation around the various aspects of this issue. So one of the things I'll be looking for is for colleagues to pop questions into the chat if you've got issues that you'd like to ask of the speakers or of the panelists. You'll see the chat. I believe the chat is in the window just below the broadcast option or the broadcast windows. So that's over to you to pop those questions in, please, because that will help me as the moderator, and that will ensure that the panelists and the speakers address the questions that you want to have answered. Now, without further ado, I'm already a minute behind schedule. I'd like to introduce Hannah Bryson Jones. Hannah's from a fabulous company in the UK called Element Energy, and Hannah's going to talk to us about supply and demand, the creation of the hydrogen economy, how, where, when. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe, for the introduction, and also thank you to Richard for the opening words this morning. Really exciting to hear more people talking about hydrogen. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you today about the supply and demand problem with hydrogen and some potential solutions that we can look at when we're designing these early projects. So I hope you can all see my screen now. I hope that I don't have to convince anyone on the call that there is a really urgent need for deep decarbonisation across all sectors of the economy. This is something that we are fairly convinced needs to happen now. However, it's important to bear this in mind when we talk about hydrogen, because we know that decarbonisation needs to happen now. It needs to happen urgently across all regions. and all sectors. And that's clearly a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. And it really means that we are ready to start thinking about hydrogen in a way that is very serious and very scalable. And so the interest in hydrogen is that it allows us to reach those really hard to reach end sectors that are going to be difficult to decarbonize through any other routes. So those being a range of different uses in industry, transport, and heating. But the other benefit of hydrogen is that it allows us to decarbonize systems in a way that increases efficiency of a decarbonized energy system through this sector coupling. And that's something that works really well at scale, and that's something we know we're going to need going forwards. It's important to note that these projects are complex. So I think supply versus demand is probably actually an oversimplification, because you have right at the start, you need large-scale renewables for hydrogen production. You need to be able to distribute that hydrogen and have sufficient hydrogen storage to balance the fluctuating energy supply. And then you have these various different complex end uses that are then all linked together and supply a huge variety of different end uses. So while these projects are really exciting, there's a level of complexity involved that makes it the activation energy to starting quite difficult. And so there are three components that we've identified that are key to kicking off a hydrogen economy. First is scale. That's clearly really important. Hydrogen is something that works particularly well once we achieve scale. Coordinated geographic rollout. There's a number of reasons why we need this, and also a number of challenges in achieving it. So, for example, with the vehicle side, we know that vehicles need to be able to travel right across Europe and not just within a limited area in a large number of end users. And then also hydrogen, being considered as an energy vector, could be produced in one region and then transported to another region to transfer renewable energy. But that's something that only works if we have international cooperation and pan-European cooperation on hydrogen. So that's going to require us to put in sufficient policy support and regulatory support for hydrogen right across the different end uses in the whole value chain. And then finally, we have to remember that as much as there is a significant ambition on hydrogen, it's still something that is in development with regards to all the technology. And so all the fantastic predictions that we're seeing on hydrogen are reliant on technology development that's still happening. And that's something that we believe needs to happen in parallel with this deployment if we're going to achieve what we need to on the timescales that we set out for ourselves. So within the hydrogen value chain, we have a huge number of different stakeholders. What I've highlighted on this slide, the stakeholders that are usually involved in hydrogen projects, but this is something that varies from project to project and needs to be optimized. And it's also something that's evolving over time. Perhaps in early stage projects, there may be a need to involve and bring equipment OEMs into that conversation. But as we move through time, equipment becomes more available and that can just be sourced from the market. So within that value chain, you have the producers, the distribution, the refueling structure and industry. And then moving downstream, you have people like fleet managers who are going to have to understand how to work with hydrogen vehicles and industrial off-takers for those green products. And then there's also, external to the project, a number of different stakeholders as well: research, policymakers, regulators, and of course the general public, who needs to achieve a level of acceptance of the technology and its implementation. So they're hugely complex projects, and we really need to consider how we can engage all the relevant people if we're to be successful in implementing these projects. So this is going to require significant levels of coordination. That's coordination on the timing of projects, the geographies of projects, and then also project scale between the supply and the demand, if we're able to achieve the scale that we want to and do this as fast as possible. So with regards to scale, there are different demands on the suppliers and the end users. So we know that suppliers need to be linked to low-cost renewables if they're to be able to produce hydrogen at an acceptable cost to the end user. For demand sources, they're going to be linked to our wherever we want to deploy, whether we want to deploy our technology. So that could be for industrial sites that are existing around Europe. We want to transform those into zero carbon sites. Also with vehicles, they are already operating in different geographies, and we need to be able to maintain that over. So there are the challenges because we need to make sure that we have production close to demand, particularly when we don't have that supply chain completely scaled up. And so making sure that we have all of that in place and coordinated geographically between supply and demand will be really important. With regards to scale, hydrogen we know is something that works incredibly well when we scale up with regards to the economics. And so we need to make sure that we maximize the scale of projects, and I'll come on to some clever ways that we may do this in a second. And so with that, the challenge is making sure that production and demand are scaled together, because otherwise the economics of hydrogen projects are really not going to work unless you can match the scale of your supply to the scale of your demand. And then finally, there's a challenge of timing. So this is a really big challenge, particularly for those who are developing supply, because that is something that takes longer to do than, for example, the time it would take to have a vehicle delivered. And so those suppliers need to make commitments ahead of time, and that's obviously a risk to their business case. There's also the requirement around doing this urgently as well, which just adds an additional pressure onto the whole situation. So you can see there are a lot of challenges, and there's ways. I'm going to come on to a case study on how some European companies have looked at solving some of these issues. So as I mentioned, we really want to scale up the demand for these projects, and a particular one that has been of interest we've seen is the combination of industry end use and transport end use. So within industry, we know there is currently a huge demand for fossil-based or grey hydrogen, and that is required at a very, very low cost. So in order to switch to green or blue hydrogen, anything low carbon, there will be a requirement for low-cost hydrogen. However, industry is able to provide demand certainty through time, so long offtake agreements, which is very much necessary to allow investment in low-carbon hydrogen production. So industry can create this large-scale secured demand. However, the prices are going to be very low. If we compare that to transport's able to provide a higher value end use for hydrogen. However, at least initially, we know that that's going to be in relatively low volumes compared to industry, and also an uncertain demand. You're not able to make those long-term offtake agreements with end users in a large number of cases. So by combining industry and transport, we're able to effectively secure a large-scale source of demand, but also increase the average price that we sell our hydrogen for, and therefore make a hybrid business case between the two end users. So I just want to briefly speak about a project that is trying to solve this coordination issue for the initiation of hydrogen in Europe. And that's H2 Accelerate, which Element Energy is acting as secretariat to. So this is a collaboration agreement between infrastructure players and truck manufacturers. And you can see on the screen, we've got really some significant players within the group here who are really trying to scale up hydrogen for trucking in Europe in the very near future. And that's because both of these parties need to make joint investments into scaling up hydrogen for trucking, both on the infrastructure refueling side and also making trucks available at an acceptable cost through series manufacturing, which again requires investment in production facilities. So within this collaboration, we see both sides of trying to create the supply and demand story, but there's also a really strong effort to engage with those external stakeholders that we discussed before. So making sure that we are able to create an evidence base to encourage the right policy and regulatory support for hydrogen trucks, and outreach to policymakers to make sure that is implemented in the right way. We are also publishing white papers which are available on our website, and these can also go some way to informing industry more broadly and the general public on the benefits of hydrogen trucking and why it's necessary for us to put so much effort into implementing that in the next decades. And then also looking at funding acquisition, which we know is really important for enabling these early stage projects. And so we see within this project, to get to the scale that we need to, we've developed a phased approach. So starting with that twin track approach of R&D and deployment simultaneously, which will allow us to both develop the technology needed, but then also learn about the performance of that technology in a real world setting. Then we view a phase of industrial scale up where we're increasing the scale of deployment, looking at thousands of trucks, through to a sustainable growth phase where we're really seeing hydrogen trucks take a significant portion of the market. And then we envision a full industrialization phase where those supply chains have fully matured, not just for the hydrogen, but also for all the components necessary within the supply chain. So truck components, electrolyzers, distribution equipment, refueling stations, and so on. And so the vision is that we would initially look at a corridor from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, just because that's where the members of H2 Accelerate are best able to support truck customers and the refueling network. But eventually we envision, with participation of other players on the market, this would be expanded to create a pan-European network that's able to serve all end users and as is necessary for truck end users to be able to roam freely across Europe. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions, or if you'd like to contact me, my email address is on the screen there. Thank you.
Hannah, many thanks for that, and many thanks for keeping to time. I know it's really difficult when we've only got 15 minutes. Colleagues on the call, I hope you're putting those questions into that chat box, because Hannah gave a fabulous presentation there. I've got lots of questions I want to ask Hannah, but it's not my job as moderator. It's your job to provide me with the questions to ask Hannah during the discussion at the end of the session. So now I'm delighted to say that I've got Nigel Holmes on the call, who's going to present to us next. Nigel runs the Scottish Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association, and Nigel's been very active in the hydrogen space within the UK and beyond. And he's going to talk to us this morning about fuel cell deployment within Scotland. Nigel, over to you.
Many thanks for the opportunity to give this update. And what I'd really like to just do is build on Hannah's comments about the chicken and egg situation and give you some examples of how we're scaling up hydrogen across Scotland in the context of some very ambitious targets for net zero. But looking at some of the examples of where we have built up early projects in Scotland and where those projects are now starting to take us. So the backdrop to this is net zero, and I think it's fair to say that since the focus on net zero, which started about 3 years ago, May 2019 was the date that the UK government, in fact, no, the Committee on Climate Change released their report advising the UK and Scottish governments to set targets for net zero. And for Scotland, net zero by 2045. That's tough, but actually there's an even tougher target, which is a 75% reduction in CO2 emissions for Scotland by 2030. So how do we get there? Well, the journey has started. Scotland is now producing pretty much all of its electricity on an annual basis from renewables, onshore wind being a key part of that. But there's still a lot more to do. And the Scottish Government in December 2020 put out their hydrogen policy statement. And this sets some ambitious targets. Some of it around the hydrogen capacity in Scotland. So the target that they set back in December 2020, that was by 2030, there should be 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production. Low carbon hydrogen being essentially, people use shorthand blue hydrogen from fossil fuel with carbon capture, green hydrogen from renewables. But this is a twin track approach, same as the UK government, looking at low carbon mixture of green and blue. Where does it all come from? Well, if it's green, it would come from renewables. And this is where some of the additional targets for Scotland are for offshore wind, 11 gigawatts by 2030, and potentially additional onshore wind of 8 to 12 gigawatts. So big generation. And linked to that, it's back to where Scotland is. So north of the UK, lots of water, lots of wind, and there's already development of offshore wind, a whole host of projects currently in some in operation, some in construction, some in advanced planning. And there is a lot more to come as well. So, having given that backdrop, what's actually been happening in Scotland with hydrogen projects? And I'd like to basically take you on a quick trip around Scotland, starting just north of Edinburgh at a location called Methil. We'll then move up to Aberdeen and Orkney, and then touch on Cromarty in terms of one of the locations where things are starting to move forward quickly. So, Methil, Leavenmouth, just north of Edinburgh. It's a location where actually there's been activity for hydrogen since 2011, when the Hydrogen Office was first opened. What you see in the picture on the right here is the wind turbine on the dock side, and just next to it is the Hydrogen Office. That location has basically been operational for many years. And it's actually a foundation for some of the awareness and outreach, talking about hydrogen to pupils, students in the local area. 30,000 pupils been through various workshops and courses. That's been important. And the other part that they've been working on are some of the demonstrators. So smart energy systems, how you integrate wind with local demand, storage and transport. And these are relatively small projects. The wind turbine there is under a megawatt. The electrolyzer capacity was about a quarter megawatt. So small compared to what people are talking about now, but it provides the learning and the foundation for doing more. And going forward, the next step is the development of a large project called the H105 Project. And the picture on the left, you can just about make out the small wind turbine at the top left of the picture. That's the one at the Hydrogen Office. The larger wind turbine is an offshore prototype, which is now running with the offshore renewable energy catapult. And energy from that turbine will be used to produce green hydrogen, which will then be distributed through a new network being laid in the streets around Methil to about 100 households. And importantly, these households will be given the choice of staying on natural gas or opting into green hydrogen. So it's a test of acceptance and of technology. And hopefully by the end of this year, middle of next year, households in Methil will be running on green hydrogen. That'll be a 18-month trial developing some of the evidence around the operational aspects, the acceptance of green hydrogen for heat. So we'll talk about that one again, hopefully in the Q&A. And moving up the coast, about 100 kilometres north of Methil, Aberdeen, and this is where there's been a lot of projects happening in Aberdeen for almost 10 years, starting with the hydrogen buses. That has built up a fleet of about 65 vehicles. And importantly, much of the original work was started off with a fuel cell and hydrogen joint undertaking funded project. So that's been an important part of the stepping stones that the projects in Aberdeen have gone through. And central to this has been the bus refueling. The refueler in Aberdeen, put into operation with the fleet in 2015, basically has given excellent reliability, high bus availability, and it's given the operators of the buses the confidence that they can actually use hydrogen buses in operational fleets. So hydrogen produced locally from electricity. The dispenser was, for a long time, the only dispenser in Aberdeen, so it had to be reliable, but it worked very well. And that's actually allowed the Aberdeen City Council to work with the operators, and we now have a new fleet of double-decker hydrogen buses. So going from 10 single-deckers, there's now 25 double-deckers, and they've been in operation for about a year now. And recently, building on that, Aberdeen has gone into a strategic partnership with BP, and this will be about building up the amount of activity around hydrogen in Aberdeen. And part of the work on developing that plan was by Element Energy. So Hannah may be able to comment on that when we come to the question time. But going forward, we also see the importance of building on the oil and gas expertise and capabilities around Aberdeen, and initiatives like the Green Hydrogen Test and Demonstration Facility will be central to actually helping to build that those skills, that expertise, that capacity to actually meet the demands of the growing hydrogen economy. And again, this could be a mixture of green and blue. We'll come back at the end towards some of the direction of travel with green, but building on the oil and gas heritage from Aberdeen as a hub for this activity, and just north of Aberdeen, St Fergus, there is the Acorn Project, which is one of the leading projects in the UK to actually start to produce blue hydrogen from natural gas. But just north of Aberdeen, in fact about another 100 kilometres north, is Cromarty, one of Scotland's natural harbours. And this is a location where, until 2 years ago, there was very little happening with hydrogen. And then they really started to look at the opportunity in terms of location, access to offshore wind, and they developed a group which started to put together some of the basic ideas for what they would do to develop Cromarty. And last year, one of the first projects for Cromarty was launched. So this has now started. It's about building 35 megawatts of electrolyzer capacity. So this won't be in operation for about another 2 years. It takes a while to get these things up and running. But it's a big step for the Port of Cromarty Firth. And linked to that, they've also started to look at the strategic partnerships. So Joe mentioned at the start the importance of starting to get these partnerships in place. These can be technical partnerships or they can be commercial partnerships. And this is one of them where Cromarty is partnering with Norway for transshipment of green hydrogen into Cromarty, so that some of the early demand can be met, not just from local hydrogen, but also from hydrogen coming from adjacent areas. And going forward, very much a vision for Cromarty in terms of a hub, starting to really develop the use of the hydrogen in industry and in transport and in other markets as well. So, mindful of time, I need to wrap through this one fairly quickly, but Orkney, just off the northern tip of Scotland, a group of islands, about 30 islands, 25,000 inhabitants, and it's been self-sufficient in electricity on an annual basis for about 7 or 8 years. But that brings its own challenges in terms of integrating renewables into the energy system. And again, one of the key steps forward here was the involvement of the FCHJU, support for a project, the Big Hit project, which was very much about developing a whole energy system approach to increasing the amount of hydrogen production and hydrogen demand, but also recognizing the importance of the infrastructure. So moving the hydrogen, storing the hydrogen, so that you can match the supply and demand, both in terms of time and place. And this built up to the launch back in 2018 with the ferry that brings the hydrogen from the island of Shappensea, the truck that moves the hydrogen, a fuel cell on the harbour in the blue box, providing backup power to ships in harbour, and some vans running on hydrogen fuel cell as battery electric range extenders. Going forward, a lot happening in Orkney. There's marine projects, there's aviation projects at the airport, there's distillery projects. Basically, go to Orkney and you'll start to see some of the activities that are taking shape. Some of the support has actually been for projects around the UK, such as the High Flyer project down at Cranfield. EMEC provided the support for that. And going forward, the airport in Orkney at Kirkwall is likely to be home to some of the trials for twin-seater fuel cell aircraft, together with other opportunities for decarbonising airport around the power and heat for the airport supplies. But just to start to wrap up, what happens next? And this is where scaling up starts to go into overdrive, linked to the opportunities from offshore wind. And there are two projects I'd like to just flag up. One in Orkney, which has been part of a recent proposal going into the Crown Estate Scotland, the Scottish Government. It's the Flotter Hydrogen Hub, and that could be using offshore wind from around Scotland to produce green hydrogen at an existing facility, which is actually an oil and gas facility. So this is very much energy transition, just transition. Similar approach happening in Shetland, Shetland to the north of Orkney. In fact, not that far from Norway as the crow flies. And again, it's about repurposing oil and gas infrastructure for production of green hydrogen, conversion of green hydrogen to other products, and export of some of those products into wider markets. And this map just shows you some of the recent leasing areas that have been announced through ScotWind, with a total of 25 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity now part of the pipeline of generation capacity, which will be operational in the 2030s in Scotland. And why does that matter? Well, it then puts Scotland into a place where potentially we can start to supply green energy, not just for decarbonisation in Scotland, UK, but also into European markets. And I think there's a number of other locations around the Baltics and Nordic states, which could also be similarly very, very strongly placed. So very quickly, Joe, just to wrap up, scaling up, we need to put the foundations in place. We need to learn by doing. And this is actually where some of the, especially the sharing best practice, the partnership approach could be absolutely critical if we're going to make this transition from fossil fuels to low carbon energy and renewables. Thank you very much for listening, and back to you, Joe.
Many thanks for those presentations this morning, colleagues. Now over to the panel discussion. So what are the key challenges in developing the hydrogen economy? How do we establish the various hydrogen production facilities? How do we transform what's going on? We've had some great presentations this morning from two presentations, and now we've got a panel to discuss these particular issues. What I'm going to do to start off with is go around the panel and ask them to give a couple of minute introductions. We've already heard a little bit from Nigel, but I'm going to ask Nigel to tell us a little bit more about his work in a second. But first of all, perhaps I can bring in the other two guests on our panel. So, Avars, would you like to introduce yourself? 2 minutes maximum, please.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, welcome everyone. Thanks first of all for Embassies for invitation and having organized that. So, my name is Ivar Starikos. I'm representing the Latvian Hydrogen Association. I'm almost 10 years chairman of the board for Latvian Hydrogen Association. In the same time, I'm also privileged to be one of the board members for Hydrogen in Europe. So to speak, I'm really truly in the heart of hydrogen ecosystem as itself. I have started all this with the hydrogen as scientific engineer, and now my everyday job is more or less, so to speak, collaborate with the speakers. When I am proud that all the speakers, I know that we were laughing that Nigel, we know each other almost 10 years, Element Energy. Or what I would like to say, that there is a team and knowledge in the field, what is necessary to create and launch hydrogen projects. And that's exactly what I'm doing, to actively collaborate across the region, to initiate in Latvia, but not only in Latvia. I would also address Lithuanian colleagues. So with Estonia and Sweden, we are working actively, but so to speak, this regional collaboration is one of the key points how we can start to do something in our backyards also. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Avers. Can I hand over next to Nikolaj, please? 2-minute introduction.
Thank you, Joe. I hope you can all hear me, and again, also pleased to be part of this interesting, of course, debate and generally the session here, and especially with this cross-border perspective of it all. I think it's extremely important, but we can come back to that, of course. My name is Nikolaj, as it says. I'm heading the business development department of the company Everfuel. We are a company developing and operating hydrogen infrastructure from production, distribution, and fueling across the Scandinavian region and currently Germany and the Benelux region. Yeah, I'm heading that department, and we are a dedicated hydrogen company. So hydrogen is all we do, and it's definitely an interesting field with a whole lot of collaborations also ongoing. Prior to a little bit of myself, prior to Everfuel, I worked in the solutions department of Nel as well, working on the equipment side of things, with all the hassles of getting the business cases to work for the end users. So coming from that background, and even before that, spent some years in the wind industry, in the team in investors. So yeah, it all kind of comes together now, full value chain. So sure, we can have some interesting discussions here. Pleased to be here. Thank you.
And Nigel, would you like to say anything more about the Scottish Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association?
I could say a lot, Joe, but I think the key thing about the association is that within our membership, we have industry, we have academics, we have local authority and city authorities. So it's actually bringing together the organizations that can actually help to create the hydrogen economy on many different levels. And we are very fortunate in that we have a lot of members that are not actually based in Scotland. And the reason for that is that they see some of the opportunities in Scotland and some of the work that's happening already. And they want to learn from what's going on. And they also, many of them are looking to take part in the activities in Scotland. So it's a broad church, and the door is open.
Thanks, Nigel. Perhaps I can stay with you for a little while. You've talked a lot about Scotland, but I also know that you're heavily engaged in the wider UK hydrogen agendas too. Perhaps you can give us a bit of an overview, maybe 2 or 3, 4 minutes on what's happening in the rest of the UK. This is the UK Baltic conference, so perhaps you could give us that wider picture, please.
Thanks, Joe. And there's some really strong dynamics for hydrogen all across the UK, and the UK government put out its hydrogen strategy, as was mentioned in the opening. Twin track approach that was launched in August last year. Also sets a target for 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen by 2030. So that's a mixture of green and blue hydrogen. And there's a lot of work going on all around the UK. So, for example, Joe, of course, within the Northwest, there's one of the early demonstrator projects for blue hydrogen production with carbon capture and storage. That's HyNet region. And likewise in Humberside, there's an advanced project for blue hydrogen carbon capture storage. as is in Scotland, the Acorn, although that is not on the first track selected by the UK government. The UK government has also been very good at picking up some of the early market adopters. So last year they opened up a competition on the Green Distilleries competition, and that was a very, very well subscribed competition. I think that they've actually expanded the scope of that competition quite considerably. And you might ask the question, well, why are they concentrating on just one area of industry? And actually, there's a very good reason for that. There are some industry sectors which are starting to put some ambitious targets in place for zero. And companies within the whiskey sector are starting to set targets for net zero production emissions by 2030. So about 8 years away. And they are looking for solutions. And one of the big challenges around industry is often the demand for heat. And that is absolutely the case with distilleries. And they're asking the question, how can we convert from using fossil fuels to using renewables for our production? And this is where hydrogen plays a massive part. It could actually start to capture renewable energy, could store that, take that to distilleries, either by pipe or by truck or produced locally, and use that for the decarbonisation of the distillery process. Now, you might say it's not the biggest industry, but actually it's a bit like the examples from Orkney and Aberdeen. You sometimes have to start with smaller projects and build it up, and then get the experience, start to get the supply chain, the standards, the operational knowledge in place before you can start to go out and do everything. So I see this as being a really important first step. And this is where the links between UK and Scotland could be really critical.
I agree with you, Nigel. Indeed, those notions of fuel switching may well be one of the key aspects that we tease out within this discussion. But before we get into that, into some of those nuances, perhaps I can bring Avars back in to talk about more broadly about what's happening in Latvia right now.
Yeah, I would say now I can proudly say that finally we had launched also our local network initiatives, but before to really touch what we have, so yes, of course, maybe most of you had heard that we have a demonstration project with hydrogen range extended trolleybuses in Riga running, a refueling station with on-site production, and that's, I would say like that. This is definitely one very important step that hydrogen is presented here, so in all aspects. But most important, I would say like that, that the job what we had did during the last years and educating stakeholders and getting on the board energy companies. Yesterday we had exactly our local association meeting with participation of Latvian Ergo, who had launched their Power to X concept. And I would say like that, the first of all key is a knowledge and exchange, because if you have a renewable providers on the board, so this is the, I would say, critical. And then you should start to consider what to do with that and what can be the benefits. But one thing is to have interested parties and industry on the board, but before that, I would like to step a little bit back, because that was very excellent way how Hanna mentioned. There is a lot of different roles of hydrogen, and the key point is what I would address to policymakers, that please do not try to make decisions on policy level, because technologies should be chosen by the market. Most important that all the market environment regulation should be not excluding hydrogen, but exactly including available, let's say, options for these solutions come to the game. Because anyway, there is, as long as hydrogen have 7 main roles, and each of that applications have a different break-even point. What I'm meaning, yes, of course, it is important to start with R&D and demonstration on small scale. But even bus fleet in one moment, and I think that Nikolai will later touch that ground, but the point is that even bus fleet is achieving break-even point by achieving necessary side. 30, 50 buses can make a business case, self-sustainable, how to make it happen. So this means every technology or every application have its own break-even point. So that's one. And most important, what I would like to highlight, as Nigel mentioned, that first of all, I'm proud that I work with Nigel and I work with Element Energy is a network. So first, this knowledge, historical knowledge, how it was well done, what was necessary to initiate, and skills, how to bring those different layers of the environment together to make something doable and with added value for society, and not only to showcase but also to provide a further vision how we can achieve all those goals. From my side, that would be most important things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eivars. You raised some really interesting questions there, and I think one of the things I'm already seeing from the two presentations or the two panelists we've had already, Nigel and Eivars, is that there seems to be a lot of different initiatives going on, and it's really very much about the policy makers picking winners, is what Nigel said to me offline, and I absolutely agree with Nigel and Eivars on that issue. But I haven't brought in Nicolaj yet. Nicolaj, would really appreciate your perspective on what's going on from an Everfuel perspective and in Denmark.
Yeah, to start from a Danish perspective, and with Denmark being to some extent our home market, then of course it's somehow linked. Of course, I'll start with also acknowledging this, that the policymakers and so forth should be very careful of not picking the winners, picking technologies, but picking the right frameworks, and then sticking to that, because that's typically what they're really good at, and then the rest will happen if the right frameworks are prioritized, or how can you say that? But from a Danish context, we have recently seen the adoption of the proposal of a national Power-to-X strategy, finally, stating a target of 4 to 6 gigawatts of electrolyzers before 2030, some interim ambitions and things like that. And considering the size of Denmark, that's a pretty ambitious chunk out of the 40 gigawatts targeted by EU. So that's all good. There's a lot of stuff going on framework conditions right now, of course linked to the stuff that goes on regarding the update of the renewable energy directives 2 and 3 and so forth. But getting a little ahead on the national implementation, also linked to the fact that Denmark a little more than a year ago, adopted this ambitious target of a 70% CO2 reduction by 2030, meaning that the policymakers also kind of needed a head start on things before the implementation of the RED and all that. Then we also see the first signs of all these great ambitions and strategies actually starting to materialize in things. That's of course the most important thing. One thing is good ambitions and plans, but how are we getting there? And there we actually see recently that the Danish TSO, which is also the Danish operator of the gas system, Energinet, has been given, to some extent, the mandate to start actually looking into a national hydrogen infrastructure in terms of pipeline linked to the European hydrogen backbone, which is, especially when we start to talk gigawatt scale Power-to-X facilities, extremely important, because there is a very practical limit on how much hydrogen you can buffer at a given site in tubes. So that's really a positive sign, and that's really recent. There is also reformations ongoing now on the tariff system and the electricity system, and especially where we see that all of a sudden it has become apparent that what we are coming from in terms of tariff systems, especially that traditional tariff systems has been very much linked to sectors independently, that there's this realization that to some extent a reformation of that is needed. And we see that now slowly surfacing with more cost real grid tariffs, the opportunity for a facility that we are building right now, opening this year, a 20 megawatt electrolyzer next to a refinery, that can work as a dispatchable load to the grid. Denmark has, as most of you probably know, a very, very high share of wind power in the system, bringing a lot of issues, positive issues, but balancing needs, and electrolyzers can definitely participate in that. And a lot of these things we see start appearing, but to kind of link back to the beginning before we can continue the more open debate is really this perspective of the need of realizing what is the system level understanding of the whole thing, because we often see in some debates, and often some very decisive debates, that then suddenly when it comes to hydrogen, people start to talk about efficiency and all that in the value chain, but not looking at the system level. Already in Denmark today, a lot of wind power is curtailed due to the system not being flexible enough. And then it's a question of 0% or 100% efficiency, or 0% or 60% efficiency of all that wind power potential. And with a lot more wind power to come in the coming years, and solar and other sources that are not that controllable, we need politicians that are educated and authorities that are educated to it in a proper way, at a proper level, to make decisions on a system level and set those frameworks accordingly long term, when then the different companies out there can do those necessary investments based on that, and not starting to pick the winners or be too focused on one specific part of the value chain.
So thanks for that, Nicolas. I know I've got quite a few questions coming into the chat, but I want to ask one question. I'd like to ask it of Avias, really, and that is about the core of this session, and that's about the infrastructure. And how on earth are we going to put the infrastructure in place? There seems to be lots of demand out there. There seems to be lots of opportunities around the supply. But how on earth, Avias, in your opinion, can we ensure that demand to supply is matched by the infrastructure in place? Avias, did you get that question?
Sorry, I missed. I was exactly looking on the chat for questions from audience. Sorry, I missed.
I was asking you. We've had a really great introductions there around the demand side, the supply chain, the different opportunities here. But how on earth, from a Latvian perspective, are you ensuring that the infrastructure is being put in place? That's the key discussion section of aspect of this particular session now. How are you ensuring the infrastructure is in place to take the demand side, to meet the supply side, etc., etc.?
Basically, that's I would say that's the most challenging point in all that, because simply saying this is a matter of planning and understanding how all this works and interacts. That's the key, because as Hanna highlighted in the presentation, there is different time periods necessary for planning, ordering, and all that. So this means you should have a specific knowledge to be capable to balance or harmonize introduction in a way that all this will start to operate in one moment. I know that Nikolai have the same challenges with Everfuel to planning bus fleets, hydrogen. No, it is a challenge. So key is a knowledge and understanding of system. Yes, in our case, that was our team's duty to figure out the way how we can provide demonstration of the project in same time to providing not only the buses to carry passenger, but also the refueling station and production in same time. So that was a challenging, but I would say only the one limit for in that case is our imagination, nothing else. Because if you have a stakeholders who are interested to achieve some targets, in our case in Riga, that was the driver was air quality. From one side, okay, city is saying, I have air quality problems. How to solve that? Of course, there is necessary science who is calculating, analyzing what kind of options are available. Then technology assessment. Is this doable? Yes, no. Infrastructure availability and efficiency as itself. Do we have such power in the power grid? Yes, no. So there is a lot of questions around before you push the launch button. But most important is the planning and overall understanding. And as even Nikolai also mentioned that it's not, you should not look only on hydrogen chain efficiency, but your overall system. If there is leftover of the wind power, hydropower, solar, which is imbalanced with the grid demand, so this is a waste of energy. Therefore, hydrogen, basically, hydrogen is not the silver bullet. Hydrogen is just unlocking those different options and giving us a chance to use this non-used energy, and first of all, ensuring resilience of the system. What is also forgotten angle of all that, because energy supply, power grid, gas grid, and hydrogen, I would say ideal world where we have 3 layers of energy supply all around. But before that, I would like to address one question which was in chat about district power heating.
Can I come back to that in a little while? I've got a lot of questions
Okay.
in the chat, and I want to come on to those now, if I may, colleagues. So I'm going to quickly run through them because we've got 15 minutes left. So the first one I've got in the chat is, how does the price of locally produced hydrogen compare to that which is imported? Nigel.
So, as they say, it all depends on what you have in place locally and what your opportunities are to access imported hydrogen. And much of this becomes commercial type discussions, but until recently, well, it probably still is the case for Scotland. It will probably be cheaper this year and next year to import green hydrogen from Norway than it will be to produce green hydrogen in Scotland. But we're starting to see some of the projects scaling up in Scotland, and I see the trend there bringing the price of the locally produced green hydrogen down fairly quickly. And then people will ask the question, well, what's the role of blue hydrogen in the mix? Because the original policy thinking was around scaling up of blue hydrogen to start to stimulate the growth of the markets, and then later green hydrogen comes in. So why are we saying green hydrogen comes first? Well, it's down to scale. Blue hydrogen projects don't happen at a community level. You need to have almost like an industrial cluster already operational for a blue hydrogen project to take shape. That's why they're in Humberside, that's why they're in Merseyside, that's why they're at St Fergus. Green hydrogen projects, on the other hand, as we've seen, can be small, local community projects, the Big Hit project being a case in point. And they are starting to scale up. So blue hydrogen, you're starting at 500 megawatts of hydrogen production, can't really go much lower. Green hydrogen projects, you're starting at 1 megawatt. We're now seeing Cromarty with 35, Glasgow with 20, Aberdeen's coming through very strongly with the BP partnership in place. So that's starting to scale up and get economies of scale. So I'm not answering a question, what is cheaper, imported or local, because it's a moving target. And again, on an international level, we'll probably start to see some hydrogen coming in from Spain, Portugal, possibly Chile, into European markets, reflecting the demand for low carbon hydrogen. And so, trying to anticipate, what happens in each place is almost impossible.
Thanks for that, Nigel. I'm going to stay with you very briefly. Another really interesting question for you is the 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen by 2030. Are there sub-targets for green or blue? And what would yours be?
So before the Scottish Government set their target, they surveyed a lot of people in Scotland. And I'm trying to remember what my exact answer was. I think at that point, and remember this was about 2 years ago, at that point, I was looking at by 2030, so to answer your question, there are no fixed policy targets for the split between green and blue. You'll get lots of opinions, but there are no fixed policy targets. My expectation a couple of years ago was that for Scotland, by 2030, we might end up with like a 50-50 of green and blue. Now, bets are off. It all depends on the rate of build out of blue, and that seems to be slowing up, unfortunately, certainly from a Scottish perspective. And the key defining factor, I think, will be the investor appetite for the different projects. And what I mean by that is the indications are that investors are looking very favorably towards large-scale green projects. But the large-scale blue projects, almost without exception, or as far as I know, without exception, need extensive public sector support to make them happen. So again, the way forward, if there is not a massive amount of public money going in to support blue hydrogen projects, I don't think they're going to take off in the timescale that is needed. But I think private investment could come in and actually bring green through very, very strongly, linked to offshore wind, linked to solar in other locations. And so that could be what actually happens will be essentially a function of where the money comes from and where the money goes.
Thanks for that, Nigel. I'd certainly encourage people to consider that debate. Really interesting issues. Certainly within the northwest of England at the moment, we have a planning application in for our first blue production facility. It is on the local authority website if people want to see it. I could go into much more detail, but I won't because I've got 9 minutes left to go through a lot of questions that are coming in from the floor. Thank you. A question to Nicolaj, please. Please, can you tell us about the success on transfer of public transport buses to hydrogen and the 300 taxis in Copenhagen? This has been target set in 2020.
Indeed. Regarding the bus side of things, we are currently fueling buses in Copenhagen now on trial. What we have experienced there on the bus side of things is that the cities have been, as Ivar said, focusing on no NOx emissions and the stuff that the city and the voters on the popular and the politicians within the cities and so forth are actually caring about. Also caring about, I say like that, the local environment in addition to the external environment, and they've really been focusing on the zero emission. And there has basically been a race between hydrogen and battery. What we see now is the first round of battery buses being deployed around the Danish cities, and hydrogen buses are being tested. That primarily due to the battery buses right now being the most low cost, and the tender rules in Denmark being strictly on cost. But what we also see now is this interest in the reason why hydrogen is being tested is, of course, because of the grid capacities, especially in the bigger cities. Not that Denmark has that many very big cities, but there will be these bottlenecks coming in the grid, which, yes, the battery bus is cheaper than the hydrogen bus, but then again, looking at the system level, there are other issues occurring and that has increasing policy awareness also from the Danish side. But the bus uptake in general, I'll say, is a little bit slower than we had hoped for, but we see movements there. On the taxi side, that has almost went faster than what we hoped for. We are already now fueling more than 100 taxis in Copenhagen, and taxis also in Aarhus, the two biggest cities in Denmark, are coming live now. We're fueling them now. So we see those cases, again, not picking the winners, because on the taxi side, a taxi operator, they need some taxis that can go around on batteries in the inner city and all that, but they also need to be able to drive to the airport and then have to hope that the people they pick up at the airport have to go to the other end of the country, because they basically say, well, I only have half a battery, then you can't go with me. They need the flexibility, the operational flexibility, and that actually also links to what you said, Nigel, in terms of the investors, or the people who in the end have to pay for all of this. Speaking of the VIP in the value chain here being the end users, essentially, because what works for the end users is what works for the value chain. And if it doesn't work for the end users, it doesn't work. Then we can do demonstration projects and so forth, but that is not making anything happen, either on an environmental level or in terms of infrastructure deployment.
I agree with the importance of that demand side, and it really takes me back to that first presentation by Hannah, making sure that we can get the demand right and over to the supply. I've got 7 minutes left, so I'm going to rattle through some of these questions and just point them at specific people on the panel. First question, how does the price of locally produced hydrogen compare with that of imported? Avars, perhaps I can ask you to address that one, please.
Yeah, I would say like that. Anyway, first of all, one key point is also levelized cost of energy. This is also forgotten angle in all this discussion, because if we are looking on whole value chain, because one important message as a reminder, hydrogen is never the primary energy resource. Hydrogen is just an either intermediate from energy resource to the end use. Therefore, if we have identified that locally there is need for additional, I don't know, 100 megawatts renewables, then on levelized costs calculation, we can achieve, I would say, fair enough price, which can be fixed for next 15 years. In that case, first of all, additional available energy, which is in that moment today, according to the grid, is a waste because it fluctuates. Then we have additional capacity and the kilowatt hours, what we can transform to the hydrogen. And the key is in long-term investments, and today there is a lot of available financial instruments for such purpose to introduce those energy valleys. This means the hydrogen costs are dramatically linked to the demand. But if all that value chain from renewable hydrogen production, storage, distribution, and end use as in one financial framework, then it can provide sustainable solution. Or basically also Nikolai touched that, but he didn't highlight total costs of ownership. Because if you should calculate not only the buying bus price of the bus, but during the lifetime of the bus, depreciation, service, fuel, then whole picture is a bit different. Because on lifetime cost analysis, hydrogen is showing already today quite significant improvements. I would say during the last 5 years, I'm seeing that there is a lot of even evidence on EU level that total costs of ownership on trains can show that it can be cheaper than diesel today. By certain size of a bus fleet, what is ever fuels business, you can achieve today fossil parity. This means you not just the right scale and financial instruments availability to make it viable.
Okay, I'm going to cut across you there. Apologies. We've got 3 or 4 minutes left, and I've got some more questions coming in that I'd like to throw out to the panel. And a key one here, I think, it's being raised in various countries that I talk to, is hydrogen, the import-export of hydrogen, and indeed the production of hydrogen is going to require vast amounts of gas storage. I'm wondering what's happening in Denmark at the moment in relation to gas storage, Nikolaj.
Yeah, in Denmark specifically, there are caverns different places around Europe. There are some in northern Germany. There are some that probably also some in the UK, I suppose. But in northern parts of Jutland, there are the salt caverns that you want to use for hydrogen. Otherwise, your hydrogen will disappear. There are salt caverns in northern Denmark, which also today holds the natural gas buffers of the country, where it's being investigated or it's basically being planned, not decided yet, but being planned as part of this pipeline deployment I alluded to before, to utilize some of these caverns for buffering hydrogen over months, seasons. Because again, referring to this project we're doing right now, opening this autumn in mid Denmark, 20 megawatt electrolyzer next to the refinery there. We can also scale that up, and we are planning to scale that up. Meanwhile, the transition of the refinery goes from fossil to green, up to 300 megawatt by 25. But if we have to go above that, there are practical limitations on how much storage you can have on one side. Of course, you could just have a continuously running electrolyzer, and then you don't need that much buffering capacity. But then the point of electrolyzers balancing the grid becomes a little obsolete. So the rollout of the hydrogen backbone is definitely something to support, because that is indeed something that can accelerate the uptake of Power-to-X projects in general, and also unlock some of these cross-border benefits of hydrogen at times being produced, for instance, in Denmark on windy days, being linked to some of our neighboring countries and vice versa. Not necessarily that production and utilization or refining of hydrogen, if that is the case, needs to happen at the exact same place. We're doing that in the Haidang Project in Denmark. We're building electrolyzer next to the refinery, scaling that up, integrating with the heat for the absorbing the heat in the district heating system, and all these things. But on the really big scale, hydrogen has the potential to create cross-border synergies, and the pipeline and buffering capacity in Catalans is part of that, unlocking that.
Many thanks for that, Nicolas. You raised issues there about domestic issues. There are questions coming into the chat around domestic and heating and domestic appliances, and all about potentially that social license to operate. And I'd love to get into those issues, but colleagues, I'm afraid to say time has passed us by. It's 10:15 already, and it's time for us to take a break. I'd like to thank all of our speakers this morning and panel members. Thank you very much. And to all you for popping those questions into that chat. Apologies I didn't get through them. For the next discussion, I'll be much more ruthless with the panelists. But 5 minutes break, everyone. We'll reassemble at 10:20. Thanks again to everyone for participating this morning. Bye for now.
Who is driving the clean transport revolution? On the road to zero emissions by 2050. With a £5 billion blueprint for cleaner, greener public transport. Which country is ending the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030? Invented the lithium-ion battery, is home to Europe's first mass production battery factory for electric vehicles, and is developing the next generation power cells at the world's most advanced open access facility. Acting as the global hub for innovation and collaboration in high-performance engineering for planes, trains and automobiles. Where will you find 80% of the world's top motorsport engineers, 7 out of 10 F1 teams, the home of Formula E and Extreme E, and has the world's fastest rate of decarbonisation with Green Grid that powers the whole mobility supply chain? Who is creating the world's first pop-up airports for flying cars and is pioneering wind assistance to ship goods across the world's oceans, reducing fuel consumption of ferries by up to 90%, navigating the Atlantic using AI and autonomous vessels, sailing ahead with high-speed propulsion to net zero by 2050. Where can you find the world's first hydrogen digger, the first ever fleet of hydrogen double-decker buses, the world's first autonomous tractor, and is decarbonising food production with precision robots? Who is propelling the jet zero revolution with the world's first hydrogen aeroplane, and was Amazon's test bed for drone delivery? Where will you find the power behind the world's clean transport solutions? We're the UK, and we're ready to trade with you.
And welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. In this second panel, we're now going to talk about the practical application of hydrogen. Now, that could be road transport, it could be maritime, I guess it could be industrial, it could be heating, etc. So we'll begin to cover off some of these issues, and we have two great speakers to kick off the session before we move into a wider discussion about what will be the first sectors, the first areas that will be using hydrogen. Please consider these issues and pop your questions again into the chat, and I'll try and get through a few more questions in this second session than I did in the first. So may I introduce our first speaker, please? That's William Darby. William's a senior consultant at Element Energy, and William will be talking about hydrogen for road transport, public transport, HGV and private users. Where do we start? William, tell me, where do we start?
As introduced, I've spent the last 3 or 4 years effectively trying to get hydrogen in public transport moving. My specific background is particularly in the UK, but I'll try and talk more broadly on the European context and then focus on some lessons that apply specifically. So I'll just kick off with a bit of an introduction. I'm sure you've got a sense of a grounding of hydrogen from the other presentations, but just to make sure we're on the same context, and then I'll come on to a bit more about where to start. So just to make sure that everyone's clear, hydrogen for use in mobility then. So there are 2 effective ways you can use it. You can use hydrogen fuel cell systems, which is visualized on the screen here. And a fuel cell vehicle is effectively an electric vehicle, but instead of having a large battery, you have a tank that you fill with compressed hydrogen, or it could be liquid hydrogen. The hydrogen is then drawn off into a fuel cell stack where it combines with oxygen from the air and creates an electric current to drive the motor. You can also combust hydrogen in a traditional diesel engine, but my focus is going to be on fuel cells specifically today. So there's a few reasons why hydrogen is specifically seen as a high potential to decarbonize mobility. You can match the duty cycles of fossil equivalents. So hydrogen vehicles have similar ranges to diesel equivalents and can fuel up in between about 3 to 15 minutes. It is an ultra low carbon technology, so has a zero, only emits effectively water vapor. And if you green up the production method using either green electrolysis or carbon capture, you have an ultra low technology. It does also improve local air quality. So there is an air filter on the front of these vehicles which filters out particulate pollution. And then a couple of other kind of key points that are seen from a more strategic point is it does sort of help to reduce fuel dependence on oil exporting nations. So hydrogen can be produced locally from renewable electricity, which drives up revenue, and certainly the manufacturing of fuel cell vehicles will help preserve kind of Europe's high-end engineering jobs. And probably the key point from an operator's perspective is while it's not yet cost competitive with diesel, we do expect that over the next sort of 10 years, hydrogen fuel cells and their technology applications in vehicles will become cost competitive with fossil equivalents. So just to sort of illustrate, I think the kind of different technologies and where they sit, the diagram just shows relatively the kind of duty cycles that can be achieved and the emissions that are related. So you have the sort of traditional vehicles down in the bottom right quadrant, battery electrics obviously in the top left and sort of slowly moving right as battery technology improves. But hydrogen is kind of similarly zero emission and does manage the same kinds of duty cycles as petrol and diesel. So just, I think you've already heard a bit about the sort of wider context of hydrogen production, but there is massive excitement now around hydrogen being produced. So this is from a Hydrogen Insights report. You can see on the left a map of all of the kind of announced projects for hydrogen production around the world, and that's significantly increased over the last few years. The graph on the right effectively visualizes that in terms of the actual production capacity. So while we live in a world today where the largest electrolyzer is only sort of 10 megawatts, we're expecting a combination of blue and green hydrogen production to reach around 45 gigawatts by 2030. So that is around 7 million tons of hydrogen production a year. So in the sense of where to start then, I think that there's a point that I'm going to make, which is that we have already started. And I think there's a few lessons to be learned from that. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of things on the ways that we've already started and the lessons that we see in terms of going forward. So there's a kind of freight and strategic motorways approach, and then there's a multimodal city hub. So, as I said, I think you could fairly convincingly argue that we've already started. I think we heard about the Copenhagen plans for 300 taxis in the previous call, but there are already around 1,000 car and van fuel cell vehicles scattered across kind of Western and Northern Europe. Buses, similarly, there's around 200 fuel cell buses on the road, and that's being driven through the sort of Jive 1 and 2 buses. So we've seen about 100 more buses deployed in the last year, and we're expecting probably around another 200 or 300 in the years to come. And then finally, probably the newest technology on the block, there are approximately 50-60 fuel cell trucks now operating in Europe, predominantly in Switzerland, and then there are a number of sort of smaller vehicles, smaller numbers of vehicles in operation in Netherlands, and numbers of prototypes across Europe. So it's fair to say we've already kind of gone through probably 10 years worth of learning of these vehicles, and I think there's a number of key takeaways. So hydrogen fundamentally, over and above what the vehicles can expect from scaling up vehicle manufacture, we're seeing that in batteries at the moment. As you scale up the numbers of vehicles deployed, the costs come down. On top of that, the hydrogen system really scales up incredibly efficiently. So if you look at the graph on the right there, that shows a kind of cost contribution of hydrogen stations from a sort of generation 1 small station at 80 kilos a day to a generation 2 station that are the stations starting to be built now around a kind of ton a day capacity. So effectively, the obvious lesson learned here is the larger the throughput of hydrogen through the station, you can bring the cost of that unit price of hydrogen down significantly. And that really helps with the ownership costs of the vehicles and helps obviously that kind of cost barrier. The second point is that these stations, larger stations, massively improve reliability. So those first generation stations have generally operated at about between 90 and 95% availability. And we're seeing these newer, larger stations operate at over 99%. And that's just generally from the fact of larger stations being able to build in more redundancy. So the question then, I suppose, is how do you get to these stations with large kind of demands? And that's effectively what we're going to talk about today, is how do you do that through the kind of different modes. So the first one, which I think is probably the hottest kind of topic at the moment around hydrogen, is the sort of freight sector and how we are moving forwards on this. So the graph on the right there shows the sort of breakdown of current European market in terms of OEM sales. And what you see is effectively the market's dominated by 7 truck manufacturers, and 6 of those have announced fuel cell truck vehicle developments. So the most impressive is probably the Daimler-Volvo joint venture of around 1.2 billion euros to develop a fuel cell truck. And they're effectively saying that those vehicles will come online between about 2024 to 2028. And that is not just a kind of a whim point. It's being driven by European emission standards for heavy duty vehicles, which is effectively ratcheting up the kinds of sanctions that are involved and the need to decarbonize. So they're all kind of seeing they need to move away from traditional combustion engines. The other point, as I've already alluded to, is there's a number of kind of new market entrants who are moving faster in the market. So Hyundai, obviously, still a global household brand, but not really a European truck manufacturer, is part of a kind of big project to try and move this market forward. So they've got 50 trucks currently operating and plans for 1,600s. And then companies like Nikola and Hyzon, who are more dedicated, kind of growing from SMEs to try and become fuel cell truck OEMs, also interested. So the point here is, I guess, how do you overcome the cost barrier? So as a sort of generalized point, effectively today, it probably costs you about double in terms of lifetime ownership costs for a hydrogen truck compared to a diesel. And what we see predicted kind of pretty consistently is that as we move towards probably the 2030s, hydrogen costs will come down as the vehicles scale up and the fuel becomes cheaper. But also there's going to be a swing point where diesel vehicles become more expensive because of carbon taxes on the fuel, and also those kind of increasingly tight emission standards are going to drive the vehicle's capital cost up. So how do you kind of overcome that cost difference today? Well, the Swiss project, the Swiss 1600 trucks project, has kind of pioneered this approach, which is being kind of called aggregated demand. So what happened in Switzerland probably now about 5 years ago was H2 Energy effectively went out and gathered up a number of truck operators, some of the largest truck operators, you can see the logos there, in Switzerland, and aligned them behind a fairly standardized selection of truck. And then went out and brought in Hyundai as a truck supplier and a number of fuel suppliers. And the system they've created so far now has 9 large-scale hydrogen refueling stations and 46 trucks in operations. And as I've said, that kind of has a plan to go to 1,600 trucks by 2025. So scale helps with that problem, but it doesn't solve it completely. And what we've seen is that this probably a very progressive tax regime from the Swiss government of around a kind of 50,000 euro per year tax break allowed them to drive that project. And so what we're seeing now is other countries have kind of taken notice, and that's really started to kind of revolutionize the view on hydrogen for heavy duty vehicles. So we've seen the German government recently announce a plan to subsidize 80% of the delta costs for vehicles and infrastructure, with companies being able to claim up to 15 million euros a year. And we're seeing states surrounding Germany effectively coming out with statements that they're going to come up with similar schemes. And again, the UK is expected to announce around £100 million fund for zero emission road freight trialling. And France has come in with a different way of doing this, which is effectively trying to introduce kind of tax breaks to allow people to over depreciate trucks. So I've given 3 examples there. There are numerous other schemes around the world. So China, even New Zealand have pretty impressive schemes on this. These are just kind of 3 different representative ways. So assuming you get the policy right for these processes, effectively what you're looking to do is visualize at the bottom here. It's kind of a 2 or 3 stage partnership process. So you get together an operator group, align them behind a sort of standard specification, bring in some OEMs who are willing to supply those vehicles based on reasonably large volumes of demand. Then you target sort of regional clusters, and clearly with trucks, that's kind of motorway trunk routes. So you're looking to find those kind of major trunk routes that a lot of truck operators operate on, and then bring in hydrogen solution providers. And then effectively you come up with a kind of network of freight corridors that allow a kind of wide area of usage and a large number of trucks in operation. So what we're starting to see is lots of these kind of projects similar to the Swiss one emerge. So probably the largest in terms of its ambition, and certainly the sort of household brand names involved, is called the H2 Accelerate collaboration. So this, you can see the logos at the bottom, is targeting 60,000 trucks and 400 stations across Europe. Some more sort of regional ones, and I personally coordinate the UK Aggregated Hydrogen Freight Consortium, is a similar kind of consortium looking for around 100 fuel cell trucks in the UK from 2025 to 2025, and then again scaling up to thousands. And Hydtrucks is a very similar process, again in sort of Belgium, the Netherlands, and West Germany. So this concept of aggregated demand is really starting to move. And again, I've just sort of visualized a bit what the UK's group here is trying to do. So you've got kind of a steering committee in this case. You've got about 10 or 15 of these large UK truck operators. We've got a couple of OEMs, so the likes of Bryson and Hyundai we spoke about, the early movers, and then currently engaging with fuel suppliers. Just to address the point, we're also looking at the sort of van operators side, so heavy van fleets as well, and I'll come on and talk about that in a little while. So It's a fairly simple process. There's some quite good data available about where sort of large trucks travel. So the map on the left is effectively a heat map of the major trunk route corridors. And then it's effectively a process of trying to map where those operator depots are to those major routes and putting the stations in place. And the strategy we've come up with then is effectively to put stations sort of in the North London, the kind of Durft and Birmingham area, up to Manchester and Leeds. So that just kind of exemplifies, I think, how you go about this. And as I say, there are very similar strategies coming out from other projects across Europe. So the other option then is a multi-modal hub, where effectively you just take a number of different vehicle modes and put them in a center of large transport demand with a few stations involved. So that's become viable because of a number of different vehicles coming onto the market. So you can see vans, refuse collection vehicles, buses, trucks, trains, ships, all coming to the market. And effectively what you do there is take a city, put in a couple of centralized hydrogen stations, and then try to get a number of different operators to purchase vehicles to load those stations up to where they're economically viable. And this is happening across Europe. So you can see in France, in the UK, there are a number of these kind of city-based hubs starting to emerge. So then just to summarize then, what we see is probably, it's not really about what's a go first strategy. We see it as a kind of hub and spoke model. So again, just using the UK as a representative example, what you try and target is a number of multimodal hubs at strategic locations and joining those up using freight corridors on the major motorway network. And we see this as effectively the cheapest way for governments and countries to put in a network of stations that allow vehicles to operate relatively freely up and down the country. So I'll finish there. Sorry about the slight rush towards the end, but hopefully that kept me in the 15 minutes.
William, thank you very much for that presentation. Really great stuff there around the whole hydrogen for transport agenda. Lots there for us to discuss. Thank you for wrapping up efficiently at the end. I'm sure people have got questions that they'll want to ask you. Please pop them into the chat, colleagues. Okay, I want to move on to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Leonaro van Vilsen. And Leonaro, please take control and talk to us about hydrogen for marine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe, for the introduction. So my name is Leonor van Velzen. I'm the Hydrogen Project Manager at the European Marine Energy Centre, or EMEC. And today I'll go into the question if hydrogen is the future for maritime. So I'll do that by quickly going to introduce EMEC. I'll also explain quickly how the Orkney Islands have started with green hydrogen and what we're doing to decarbonize the maritime sector. And I'll finish with a quick conclusion. So first of all, EMEC. We are located on the Orkney Islands, and Nigel Holmes also mentioned it before. So the Orkney Islands are an archipelago, I say that wrong, but I'll go with it, of about 70 islands in the north of Scotland, of which about 20 are inhabited. So this location is very much exposed to the elements, which means that it's an excellent wind, wave, and tidal, has excellent wave, wind, and tidal resources. So it's also a great location to test wave and tidal devices. So EMEC has been set up in 2003 to as a center of excellence on marine energy research and development. So it's basically an incubator for the development of wave and tidal devices. So when I talk about wave and tidal devices, I'll just give an indication of what I mean with those. So here are two examples. So on the left side, you see 3 pictures of the tidal energy device that is developed by Orbital Marine Power. And then on the right side, you see a wave energy device, which is the Blue X, which is developed by Motion Energy. Then you might say, why hydrogen if you're set up as a wave and tidal device testing center? So now with all the resources that Orkney has, it's actually able to produce more electricity than its demand. So because we're at the edges of the electricity grid, there are constraints on feeding back the renewable generation into the grid. At EMEC, we therefore started to consider in about 2015 to consider producing hydrogen from otherwise curtailed power. So what we're doing is demonstrating the role for hydrogen in the island's energy transition. And our focus really is on Orkney, where we have this abundance of renewable sources and power. But we actually don't have a gas grid, and we are heavily dependent on planes and ferries, as they are our connection to the rest of the world, really. So they are our lifelines. So within these island boundaries, hydrogen can really be a means to an end in these relatively 3 simple steps. So 1, make hydrogen when renewable supplies exceed the export capacity. 2, transport it to a location of use on the islands. And 3, use it as a low carbon energy source for a range of different applications, from transport, so looking at vans, ferries, planes, but also heating and power supply. So I'll go slightly more into detail in these 3 steps. So for production, we go to the island of Edie. And this is where we have our EMEC hydrogen production site. And this is next to the tidal power test site. And I want to draw specific attention here to the energy system integration aspect of what we're doing. So we're currently in the process of commissioning a flow cell battery, which means that we can then connect the wind and tidal power to the battery that then powers the battery, which is then linked to the electrolyzer. And therefore we have a more controlled input and therefore output from the electrolyzer. So all of this might be quite on a relatively small scale, but it's still a huge undertaking with a lot of different partners. And there's also lots of lessons learned and also a lot of lessons to be learned. And this is not only lessons learned for Orkney, but also it can also be useful for the rest of the world. Then once the hydrogen is produced, it needs to go off of the island of Edie, and it needs to go to the Orkney mainland. So this is done by the use of hydrogen trailers, and the compressed gas is stored in cylinders in these trailers, and the trailers then go onto the ferry. And this has also led to a first-of-a-kind training course, which was developed by Orkney College. And this was done to equip the mariners with the necessary skills and knowledge to work on board of a hydrogen-fueled ship. So once it gets to the mainland of Orkney, it can go to wherever the hydrogen is required. And one of those requirements will be the maritime sector. So as I mentioned, Orkney depends on its ferries. So we have 9 vessels, which use about 2.8 million litres of gas oil per year. So we're now on the mission to decarbonise this. And that's very much in line with the UK government's Clean Maritime Plan as well. And this was released in 2019. So EMEC has been involved in a few different projects that work towards that goal as well. So one of them is the Haidang Project, which is funded by the UK government, by the Innovate UK, and this was led by Ferguson Marine. And this investigated the technical, regulatory, and health and safety challenges of integrating the hydrogen fuel into an existing diesel-powered auxiliary engine. And this was done on a commercial vessel here on Orkney. Now, this was also the project where that delivered the crew training that I mentioned before. And I should say, though, that we did run into a few regulatory challenges, which in the end meant that we couldn't actually do the demonstration of running the engine on hydrogen or the mixture of hydrogen. However, we did learn a lot in this process, and therefore it's very much a stepping stone to the HyMet project. So within the HyMet project, we are taking smaller steps, breaking down that regulatory process whilst moving forward to decarbonize the maritime sector. And HyMet is funded under by the Department for Transport under the Clean Maritime Demonstration Competition, and that has in total 55 projects. And the HyMet project specifically has 11 project partners, and we have 7 months to do all the work. So that also means that the smaller steps that I'm talking about, that by breaking down the process, does not mean that it's less ambitious. So the main focus of the HyMet project is the development through deployment of several zero-emission technologies for the whole lifecycle maritime applications. So within the consortium, we will be testing a propulsion engine, which is running on hydrogen, and this is done at Ricardo's test facilities in Shoreham. We will also consider the shoreside infrastructure, which will include the demonstration of a hydrogen engine that supports a crew welfare unit, and this is done at the Hatston Pier in Orkney. We'll also demonstrate a hydrogen storage container, which then supplies the hydrogen to a hydrogen fuel cell. And this is a demonstration on board a vessel here on Orkney. And this hydrogen storage container, together with the fuel cell, is a standalone system. So with that, I mean it's not connected to the vessel to provide any power. And this is really what I mean in terms of the seemingly small step that we're taking forward, as it's not actually powering the vessel. However, by getting approval for this smaller step, this should then pave the way for future regulations. And then finally, within this project, there's also desk-based studies that look at the net zero infrastructure and also at the future fuel pathways. So then talking about future fuels, going about future fuels, there are of course other fuels out there that could support decarbonization of the maritime sector, such as methanol and ammonia. And hydrogen is very much a building block here. It's giving that opportunity for these other fuels that might be more relevant for other applications, for example, longer distances. So even though within Orkney, there have been opportunities identified to work with these fuels, it's not the focus of my presentation for today. So with that, I've gone through it quite quickly, and I will go to my conclusions and to answer the question of, is hydrogen the future for maritime? So I'd like to say on this that green hydrogen can be this building block to decarbonize the maritime sector, either in its purest form and as well as a derivative, because we'll need this range of solutions to tackle this challenge of decarbonization. And to get there, collaboration is really key. Collaboration between different organizations, so from developers to regulatory bodies such as the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, but also collaboration between different countries. So that said, thank you very much for this opportunity to share EMEX experiences with all of you. And we look forward to support innovation together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Leonore. Thank you very much, William, as well. We'll now move on to the panel discussion where we're going to discuss further which sectors are ready for hydrogen, which sectors will be going first. We've heard a little bit about mobility, we've heard a little bit about maritime, but I'm delighted that we've got some other speakers here as well to consider some of the issues. Colleagues on the call, please pop those questions into the chat so that I can get them to our panelists to address. But before I go to those questions, perhaps I can ask each of the panelists to provide a brief, no more than 2 minutes introduction, please. So first of all, can I introduce Sven from Estonia?
Hi, thank you, Joe. A great pleasure to be here. So I'm Sven Parkel from Estonian Hydrogen Cluster, and I'm very thankful for the organizers for firstly organizing this event and secondly giving me a chance to be present here. I think what was very well reflected in Leonard's presentation is that this kind of best practice exchange and this kind of events where we can discuss and talk about the many aspects of starting the green hydrogen economy are extremely relevant. So when we're talking about Estonia, Estonia has a little bit different position when comparing to many of those European countries when we're talking about decarbonization and use of green hydrogen. And the fact is that currently in Estonia, we don't have really an industry that we can decarbonize when substituting gray hydrogen for green hydrogen. And this sort of creates another range of opportunities, but also rather another range of realities and challenges for us. And this means that the green hydrogen production and consumption have to be started in Estonia at the same time. So we currently have neither. And for this, we, from the Estonian hydrogen cluster, we propose developments of full value chains, where in the regional parts of Estonia, the production of green hydrogen and the use of green hydrogen will be set up more or less at the same time, because one can't really survive without the other. And for this, or this is sort of the main challenge, the main work of Estonian hydrogen cluster these days, where we bring together these different actors in these regions and then trying to support setting up those full value chains for starting the green hydrogen economy in Estonia. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Sven. Matthias, can you introduce yourself, please? Matthias, you're on mute.
Thank you for pointing that out. Everybody should do that sometime. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to share my views of the refining sector's challenges decarbonizing. Of course, I'm representing my company Preem, which is Sweden's largest fuel producer and also Sweden's largest producer of advanced biofuels to date. And we have a very ambitious plan to decarbonize our company in the coming 15 years. I have a background in technology, so I'm a chemical engineer by trade. But now ventured into the financing segment. But therefore, I have sort of a unique opportunity to share the more industrial view on the usage of hydrogen within the refining sector, and also how to develop new business models based on new type of sources of hydrogen. I like to share that with you today. And of course, as you probably are aware, that refining sector has been using hydrogen in industrial processes for almost a century now, as sort of a feedstock for different catalytic processes. And even though that we are transforming from fossil refining into biorefining, hydrogen will be a key source of material for the transformation going forward as well. So thank you.
Many thanks for that, Matthias. We've got much to talk about. Our colleagues, I work within the curtilage of an oil refinery, which is arguably leading on the energy transition within the UK, with some major propositions around hydrogen production. But it's a refinery that's been using hydrogen for a long time. This isn't new to a refinery perspective. So thanks for that, Matthias. Finally, Vidas from an auto perspective. 2-minute introduction, please.
Yes, hello. To start with, I'm Vice President at Alternative Fuels and Infrastructure Association of Lithuania, and as well I'm a member of the board as at the group of companies as Gedujos, which is a pioneer and active developer of alternative and cleaner fuels for transportation. And actually, we are producing already hydrogen since 2013 and using in transport from 2014. About 2 years ago, we managed to source green electricity as a supply. So the hydrogen which is used in transportation is green hydrogen since then, and is as our topic of discussion is which sectors will be using hydrogen. So we are very strong believers in transportation sector, as it is happening already now. We believe that volumes should increase, and one important aspect which I would like to notice before the discussion, that in transport there's a possibility to use hydrogen in already existing technologies, as internal combustion engines were mentioned. And to put it in simple words, to build something from scratch costs a lot, but to make use in the system which is already existing, sometimes it's quite cost efficient. So we have walked this path, and we believe this is one of the solutions how hydrogen can be introduced for the broader market.
Thank you very much for that, Vidas. Colleagues, remember to pop those questions into the chat. I am going to try and get through them, but I'm just going to go around the panelists with this issue and focus minds on the purpose of this particular discussion panel now. And that's the issue of which sectors will be using hydrogen first, which areas. So Sven, question for you. Which do you think will go first? Notions of fuel switching, possibly power, possibly transport, possibly heating. Which areas do you think will go first?
Right. Thank you, Joe. So I think to dig into this question, we first need to understand what is the motivation of Estonia to go towards green hydrogen economy. As I mentioned, half story of this is that we currently don't have an industry that we need to restructure or make more sustainable. And as you may know, the Estonia is part of the just transmission, is one of the just transmission regions, and part of this Europe-wide plan to decarbonize many aspects of the economies. And which this means to Estonia is that what it means to Estonia is that we have to close down our current electricity production from the oil shale. And this is sort of the main factor that drives the Estonian economy towards green hydrogen. To keep our electricity production ongoing, we will need to rely more on the wind parks, for example, specifically offshore wind parks and also solar parks. Now, what does it mean is that while the oil shale production is easy to balance and this is clearly controllable, the electricity from those oil shale production plants, the electricity that we get from wind and solar is not that easily controllable. And here is where the green hydrogen comes to play in Estonian economy. So which means that we have to create the green hydrogen production and use to make sure that we are able to balance the wind parks and solar parks that are currently planned in Estonia. So if we look, for example, the plans on the coastal line around our islands, then 21.7 gigawatts of wind parks have been planned there, which would result about 8 times as much electricity production and as Estonia will use per year. So although all of those parks probably will not be added to the grid, then still, if a large portion of these parks will realize, then will be materialized, then we're looking how to balance this type of electricity production. And now, if we have that electricity, of course, it makes sense to make green hydrogen from this, as green hydrogen is the best solution to scalably stabilize this type of renewable electricity production for a longer period of time. And now we come to the question, what can we do with this hydrogen? And of course, if we look at the best practices in Europe and the knowledge and experience from other regions, then the easiest answer is, of course, land transport. And we're talking about the buses here, we're talking about trucks, and we're talking about long-term, long-distance travel. But also in Estonian case, if we're actually working on balancing these large-scale parks, then we're also talking about a transport that is not long range and could be a city transport or perhaps even taxis. And this could be the sort of the first step going forward in the upcoming years. And the Estonian government is actually very much involved in setting up the hydrogen economy. And last year they started with mapping the pilot projects, the interested parties who would be willing to start with a pilot project in Estonia, and then this was followed up end of last year with a roadmap, with developing a roadmap, and so we see also a clear interest from government side to support and develop these initiatives. But coming back to the sectors, I think the road in Estonia, the road travel will be the first one, and the first pilot project where government supports the project with 5 million euros will very likely go to setting up a hydrogen production with use in taxis, and this is probably the first pilot project, which hopefully will be followed by others. And then, yes, as been already discussed, the Maritime Solutions, as we are a country with a coastal line, then the Maritime Solutions are definitely relevant. A bit later, maybe in the future, the aviation solutions, the aviation cluster in Estonia is very interested. They're very active. They're doing a lot of good work in this regard. And then perhaps the industry and also perhaps other activities.
Right. So maybe I should continue trying to offer a perspective from Sweden and also from the refining sector. Now, Sweden is, as probably many of you know, already quite decarbonized in many aspects. We have almost a electricity grid with electricity production that is almost decarbonized. And there is a lot of development going on, especially in offshore and onshore wind. So, of course, that will add a lot of variable power generation to the grid. And, of course, being able to utilize that variable power will be key to stabilizing the grid, as many of the panelists here said already. And as you probably already know, there's a lot of industries looking into utilizing hydrogen as a means for decarbonizing the industry. Hybrid with our mining industry in the north is a clear example of this. Simultaneously, we have quite a large refining sector in Sweden that not only supplies fuels today to the transport sector in Sweden, but also to the nearby markets. And Preem has embarked now on trying to transform our company from a traditional refiner into a biorefiner. And we've started that journey roughly 12 years ago when we commissioned our first co-processing plant in the Gothenburg refinery here behind me in the virtual background, where we are producing hydrogenated vegetable oil, HVO, which is a diesel quality based on renewable feedstocks. Now, in order to produce HVO, of course, you need quite a lot of hydrogen. Fortunately, we've been using hydrogen, as I alluded to in my initial statement, for almost a century in the refining sector. And moving from the original feedstock, which is crude oil, into bio-oils, the demand for hydrogen to process that bio-oil goes up. Therefore, our sector will, on a volume basis, increase the utilization of hydrogen. Traditionally, we've been using hydrogen from different type of reforming processes. You're reforming either natural gas or naphtha into other components or directly into hydrogen as a source for that hydrogen that we use internally in the refinery. Now, as we are switching feedstock, the refinery fuel gas is going to become more and more consistent of renewable gases, non-condensables like methane, ethane, and so forth. And feeding those into steam methane reformers will, of course, allow you to produce green hydrogen from those sources. But throughout the transition, we would probably require still natural gas, but that could also be switched to biogas. Now, in recent years, we have been looking into hydrogen from electrolyzers as well, because we have seen that with certain business models, there could be an incentive to actually use electrolytical produced hydrogen in our biorefining processes as a means to adding additional hydrogen capacity to our internal grids. And of course, in Sweden, historically, we've had fairly reasonable prices for electricity, which would have made this competitive versus buying natural gas. Now, over the last 6 months, this situation has shifted quite dramatically, and gas prices are now even higher, incentivizing green hydrogen from electrolyzers even more. So as we are decarbonizing the feedstock and the internal refinery fuel gases, we are also looking into adding hydrogen from other sources as well, which could further decarbonize the refining sector. Thank you.
Yes, so regarding hydrogen, and as my experience and activities are mostly related to mobility or transportation sector, so naturally I am a big believer in certain role in that area. And as I mentioned already before, there's a interesting way of achieving it via very cost-effective way, rather than spending those millions, which are usually scary to start with. Other than that, we believe that hydrogen is a really important link between energy sector for balancing, and then this produced hydrogen from overcapacities or overproduction of energy can be used in a good manner for transportation, as well for industry and all other applications where energy is needed. Or I haven't heard it today, but we quite often name hydrogen as another way of battery or alternative to battery. So this is quite convenient way to store the energy. And talking about the future, what will happen? Biogas was mentioned, and we believe that biogas is one of the important elements in decarbonization process. But with the years to come, maybe in a decade or even more, hydrogen can be replacing natural gas, which is in use today. And specific to Lithuania, for example, we have quite well developed natural gas transmission and distribution networks. So in some years, some parts of those networks can be upgraded to be used in blends. And within few more years, actually, parts of those networks can be upgraded to be used with pure hydrogen. And in the very end, this hydrogen can be used in not only transportation, which is obvious, not only in industry, but maybe even in households for additional power, for peak power supply, and so on and so forth. So let's say potential is really, really big, and I'm looking forward to see how it happens.
Thank you, Vidas. So it seems that we're still waiting Joe back, and I think we're all wishing that everything is fine with him, and it's just a technical issue that is keeping him from this panel. So in the meantime, I would go forward with the questions Joe provided us a little bit before, and he was actually asking about the national ambition and any pilot projects that clearly are coming from this, and how the government is building into this and supporting going forward. So maybe to open up with a couple of words from Estonian side as a follow-up to what I already started in the when answering the last question is that from the national point of view, we see quite a bit of or quite clear commitment from the government side, and a lot of interest towards starting the green hydrogen economy. And as I mentioned, the mapping of the pilot project was finalized mid last year, and this was followed up by the consultation rounds and first draft of the Estonian roadmap. So which hopefully will be as a basis for Estonia's strategy for green hydrogen, as hopefully I quite clearly explained the need for in my previous point as well. So, but Estonia has a plan to support setting up the green hydrogen economy with two measures, and I briefly mentioned the €5 million measure, which the winner was already announced some weeks ago, and this year we will follow this up, or the Estonian government will follow this up with 50 million measure to support setting up the green hydrogen economy while supporting the full value chain in either transportation sector or in industry. So these are both very clear statements that can be used for setting up the hydrogen economy, and in both cases, I think, or the both sub cases of the 50 million measure, the transport sector and the industry show where Estonia sees the potential when we're talking about setting up green hydrogen in Estonia. So it's either in transport, and as you already know, buses have been driving for over 25 million kilometers in Europe, and a lot of good examples, for example, from Tokyo Olympics and so on and so forth. So it's in Estonia, we're talking about clear support for transport sector and also in industry. But how's the experience in other sectors? Maybe Matthias, and you can comment on this as well.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe I should start. So the Swedish government have several different programs to support the decarbonization of both industry and transportation maritime sectors. They are done through various government agencies. One of the ones that we have been using from our for our project is the energy agencies called Energi Industriklivet, which is a support program for direct subsidies for various projects. Moreover, the industries in the mining sector has also applied for grants from these programs and have been awarded significant amounts of capital to do both pilot tests but also large-scale investments. Now, one of the main components when decarbonizing the transport sector is, of course, the mandatory blend of low carbon fuels into the fuel pool. And this can be done in various forms, and it's been implemented as a result of the Renewable Energy Directive from the EU in various ways in different countries. Some countries implemented a volume-based mandatory blend system. Others have implemented a reduction quota system where you actually calculate through a life cycle assessment of the fuel the emissions along the value chain of producing that fuel and then using it in an end user. Now, such a system would actually give incentives to produce green or low carbon hydrogen, because when you do these life cycle assessments, if you have added hydrogen to your renewable product from fossil sources, your product will suffer from lower greenhouse gas emission values. But if you would produce hydrogen in a sustainable way, i.e. using biogas as a source for steam methane reforming, or using renewable electricity through electrolyzers, that would benefit your end fuel, and that would sort of add value to that fuel. So implementing these type of regulatory measures in a way that would incentivize you throughout the value chain not to add carbon to the atmosphere can indirectly benefit these type of projects. So in that respect, the government is supporting the transition both through direct subsidies, of course under the state aid rules, but also through initiating these type of mandatory blends in the transport sector that allows you to sort of benefit if you are conscious throughout your value chain for how much sort of carbon dioxide through a life cycle assessment that you put into the atmosphere. And the last thing that they have is also the possibility to apply for green guarantees from the Swedish Debt Office, that if you are embarking on a decarbonization project, that you can apply to have the capital that you raised backed up by guarantees from the state, which would of course give comfort to any investor coming in with debt capital.
Yes, when regarding Lithuania, it's a combination of those things that Matthias just mentioned, and yes, there are some incentives from the government directed specifically towards hydrogen. There's a special program to promote hydrogen in energy sector. It is in the very first stages, but let's say conditions are under development at the moment and should be announced pretty soon. What relates to the transport, it's as well quite similar scheme as in Sweden, and most probably in most European countries, as fuel suppliers are obliged to introduce a certain percentage of renewable energy in the total sales or in the total supply. And biomethane, green hydrogen, and other let's say green solutions are becoming interesting and finally becoming economically thinkable or sometimes even usable for achieving those goals. So far in Lithuania we are using electrolysis for production of mentioned hydrogen that we use for transportation, and most probably electrolysis will remain for some time the dominating technology for this aspect. And regarding other initiatives in transportation sector, let's say technology neutral approach is often used, and basically government announces subsidies for purchasing of cleaner vehicles, not specifying should it be electrical, gas driven or hydrogen driven, and then finally evaluation is on the result of CO2 savings and cost effectiveness. So let's say if to look at this technology neutral technology approach, pure hydrogen was not succeeding that much, but situation is changing, and again, it depends on evaluation criteria, and especially on how broad we are looking into the results, which is very important that it should be holistic view, basically to take into account emissions and pollutions from production of the energy source, from the energy source to the usage, not only at the point of usage. So this is the way how it works in Lithuania so far.
Thank you, Matthias and Vidas. I think you're both touching upon a very, very important aspects, and I think one of them is that in the future, the used mix of energy, it will be a portfolio. So I think sometimes the people, or let's say the hydrogen, people who are less enthusiastic about hydrogen are more optimistic than I am, in the sense that they're imagining that the world will be only working on hydrogen from one point forward. So this is probably not going to be true, and we have to consider many different options. You both mentioned biogas, and there are other ways how to reduce the carbon footprint or the CO2 emissions already in a very sustainable and clear way already in the near future. And going forward, from Matthias's point, I think you very well exemplified how sort of the complexity or how many options we have going forward towards Fit for 55, and what kind of different options we may have when we're talking about decarbonization of different industries, and for this sense, this kind of information exchange and learning from the practices from each other is extremely important. But until we have Joe with us, I would actually take the last question from his set of questions, and as we already saw and mentioned, we have each regions we have a specific range of challenges, and which means that sort of there could be a variety of financial tools or incentives and different revenue and business models that might work in your specific ecosystem. So would you be willing to discuss one kind of example, for example, where you need or where you see a clear use case, and these can be solved, or this can be supported one way or another, or a novel business model have been developed from that? So for example, Matthias, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I think I also alluded to this type of business model sort of already existing now. As a comparison, the Swedish system for our transportation sector incentivizes you or sort of penalizes you if you do not comply with the reduction mandates of the fuels that you sell. Now, if you do sell a fuel that has an 80% reduction value when you have used natural gas as the source of producing hydrogen. Now, if you would switch to maybe electrolysis and utilize renewable power to produce hydrogen, your carbon emissions throughout the value chain, and of course the greenhouse gas emission value of your fuel would be even better, and that would allow you to sell a fuel with better greenhouse gas emission values, which you could actually pay for additional costs that you might incur from producing hydrogen from a more expensive source like electrolysis. I think that is an interesting business model that works in Sweden and in similar countries where they have implemented a reduction quota system instead of a volume-based blend system. Like Germany has a similar system as Sweden, and if you take Norway, for instance, they have a volume-based system that is harder to incentivize this type of switching of hydrogen sources in our industry.
Thank you, Matthias. Vidas, do you have something from Lithuanian aspects?
Two things maybe. First, just a reaction to heard before, or what is happening in general. I believe that biomethane or biogas is heavily underlooked or not evaluated properly at the moment as a tool for decarbonization. If we are talking about an aim as reduction of greenhouse gases emissions, and sometimes technology is being chosen in the first place, and then tried to apply in various sectors, and maybe that's not the rightest way to go. But on the other hand, if we see hydrogen as a product or as a tool to be introduced, so definitely first applications we see in transportation, because there's quite a lot of happening in terms of requirements for reducing emissions and for change, and most probably as transportation is let's say many small vehicles or small equipment working in the field, so it's simple to change small parts, not just one huge, as to compare, let's say, chemical sector or petroleum production, where the entire sector has to change in overnight. So we believe in small steps and step-by-step approach in that direction.
Thank you, Vidas. So our time is almost up. So I'm very thankful and for the opportunity to be here. I think in Estonia we're also dealing with the same range of issues and trying to figure out what is the good business model and what are the right incentives to set up the first use in transportation. So I think all these discussions and actually understanding the whole complexity of the system is very, very relevant, and we will learn a lot more going forward from regions like Sweden, for example, where the understanding of the decarbonization is already on a bit different level, perhaps than we have now today. So it was a great pleasure to participate here, and I'm hoping everything is okay with Thomas, who lost. So sorry, not Thomas, but Joe. But yes, thank you, and for the organizers, successful event going forward, and for all the listeners as well.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Yes, if we look into the agenda, it looks like it's 20 minutes break should be right now. So thank you for discussion and have a great day ahead.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Who is driving the clean transport revolution on the road to zero emissions by 2050? With a £5 billion blueprint for cleaner, greener public transport. Which country is ending the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030? Invented the lithium-ion battery, is home to Europe's first mass production battery factory for electric vehicles, and is developing the next generation power cells at the world's most advanced open access facility. Acting as the global hub for innovation and collaboration in high-performance engineering for planes, trains, and automobiles. Where will you find 80% of the world's top motorsport engineers, 7 out of 10 F1 teams, the home of Formula E and Extreme E, and has the world's fastest rate of decarbonisation with Green Grid that powers the whole mobility supply chain? Who is creating the world's first pop-up airports for flying cars and is pioneering wind assistance to ship goods across the world's oceans, reducing fuel consumption of ferries by up to 90%, navigating the Atlantic using AI and autonomous vessels, sailing ahead with high-speed propulsion to net zero by 2050? Where can you find the world's first hydrogen digger, the first ever fleet of hydrogen double-decker buses, the world's first autonomous tractor, and is decarbonising food production with precision robots? Who is propelling the jet zero revolution with the world's first hydrogen aeroplane, and was Amazon's test bed for drone delivery? Where will you find the power behind the world's clean transport solutions? We're the UK, and we're ready to trade with you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name's Nigel Brannan, and I'm director of the UK Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Supergen Hub, which is the caption on the left there, which is the main programme in the UK for funding research in the academic community in the space of hydrogen and fuel cells. And if anyone wants to follow up on any of the points later, be pleased to do that. I'm also chair of the Imperial Sustainable Gas Institute. And I want to talk to you today about the role of hydrogen in supporting a low carbon transition of the UK economy and highlight some of the drivers and some of the challenges. So next slide, please. So in the time I've got, which will be quite brief, I want to work through a number of topics. Firstly, why and where might we need hydrogen in a low carbon economy? Other speakers may have touched on it, but it's important to recognize that hydrogen is an energy carrier that can be produced from a variety of sources, and that will have different carbon implications. Touch on some of the opportunities for hydrogen and related to fuel cells for transport, for heat and power, and for system balancing as a longer term energy storage medium, and its application for some areas of industrial decarbonisation. So next slide, please. And again, next slide, please. So this is a picture for which I'm grateful for colleagues at the University of Birmingham who map energy flows through the UK energy system. And this is really sets the context for the challenge. And if we look at the red line at the bottom, that's the flow of energy through the UK system as electricity. The more horizontal line, the grey line in the centre, is the flow of energy as transport fuels. Interesting to see the drop, for example, around COVID hitting on transport fuel demand. Essentially all of that transport fuel demand today is fossil based. And then the blue line at the top is energy demand flowing as natural gas. And the challenge for us, much of that for heat, the challenge for us is how do we move all of these vectors into a low carbon energy system, recognizing that electricity, which is the red line at the bottom, is clearly low carbon electricity. Green electricity is clearly an important driver there. But that actually that's the smallest flow of energy through the system. And if we're going to displace transport fuels and heat with electricity alone, that creates an enormous challenge. And so the question is, can low carbon molecules like hydrogen play an important role in supporting the decarbonisation of this energy system alongside low carbon electricity? And certainly my thesis is that yes, it can in targeted and selected areas. Next slide, please. So we need to think about the carbon intensity of hydrogen. Of course, we make hydrogen today on an industrial scale, primarily as a chemical feedstock for the petrochemicals system processes, for example. And most of that is made from fossil fuels, from natural gas and coal. If we're moving to using hydrogen as a low carbon energy carrier, then we can't continue to do that. If we're going to make it from fossil fuels, we need to sequester the carbon as CO2, and that needs to be part of carbon capture and storage schemes. That doesn't make zero carbon hydrogen, but it certainly makes lower carbon hydrogen. If we make the hydrogen by electrolysis, where those electrons are produced from renewables or perhaps from nuclear, then we can have green hydrogen with with very limited carbon emissions or zero carbon emissions if it's made from renewables. And so this, both of those are opportunities for us to decarbonize the economy, and they both have different characteristics. Next slide, please. So anyone who wants to dig into this in a bit more detail, I haven't got time to go into it now really, is welcome to look at reports like this. This is produced from the Royal Society, and I was part of the team that put this report together. And essentially what it shows you is that there's a variety of conversion processes through which we can take electricity, shown there as the power grid, produced by a variety of means, and take that through different routes, electrolysis routes, we can take thermochemical routes, we can take biological routes, all of which can produce green hydrogen from different input streams, or we can take fossil-based fuels, or indeed bio-based fuels, and put those through carbon capture and storage and produce lower carbon or even negative emission carbon if we use biomass as a feedstock, hydrogen if we use biomass as a feedstock. So one of the advantages of hydrogen is this flexibility by which we can produce it. Next slide, please. So this is comes from a paper we wrote some years ago now, based on the work in the Supergen in part. And again, it just shows that as part of an energy system, hydrogen has a role to play, whether that's blue, which is the blue boxes there, or green, which is the green boxes, in terms of its production, its distribution, its storage, and its end use. And it can be it finds end use in a variety of applications. Transport has been a focus for hydrogen as a carrier fuel for a long time. We'll perhaps talk about where that stands in a moment, but also potentially as a source of heat or power for buildings, and as a source of heat and indeed perhaps power for industrial applications. And so I think it's very much the role of hydrogen in the energy system as a whole. That is the focus of interest and opportunity today. If I look back even just a relatively small number of years, there really wasn't the same focus on hydrogen as an energy carrier as we find today. And it's really the commitment to governments to a truly net zero energy system that's driven the interest that we're seeing in hydrogen, because hydrogen is best suited to decarbonize those parts of the economy that are really hard to do with electricity. And that's important to recognize, because we obviously, if electrical power is our input and our electrolyzers are perhaps somewhere between 65 and 85% efficient, we're paying a penalty for making that hydrogen. So there has to be a system benefit to producing it and using it. And it's in those tough areas that we'll talk about where I think it has most merit. Okay, next slide, please. Green hydrogen today is expensive hydrogen. It's certainly a lot more expensive than grey hydrogen, so hydrogen made from fossil fuels. Blue hydrogen today is probably cheaper than green, but all of the forecasts suggest that green will ultimately be the lowest cost of hydrogen. That said, the price of making green hydrogen, and this is a report from ARENA, which I think is a good report for painting a picture of cost down options for hydrogen going forward, which takes you to about $1 a kilogram per kilogram of hydrogen, which is seen as a very cost-effective target. All the green hydrogen today is really dominated by the price of the electricity that's used to produce it, about 60 to 80% of the cost. So a lot of the cost down comes off the back of falling renewable power prices, together, of course, with lower manufacturing costs, in particular driven by scale and increases in manufacturing scale. And there's a number of other important sort of technical advances that help to continue that cost down journey. But there are glide paths seen in the sector to much lower hydrogen prices than we see today, particularly for green hydrogen. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to move now on to some of the application areas. And so next slide, please. So for a long time, hydrogen cars have been a focus, but I'm not going to talk about those. I think that battery electric is really starting to dominate the light-duty vehicle sector. But those areas of transport which are harder to do with battery electric, I think, are where hydrogen has a role to play. I particularly cite its role in buses, for example. We have programs around the world, in the US, in Asia, and in the UK, and elsewhere in Europe, looking at hydrogen fuel cell electric buses. And I think this is a really potentially important area for the application. In this case, the hydrogen is converted to electrical power using a fuel cell on board the bus. Next slide, please. Another area that's emerging as well is around hydrogen fuel cell powered electric trains. So to replace diesel electric on suburban lines, in particular where the investment in electrification of the line cannot be justified, and yet there's still a desire to move away from diesel. Germany in particular and Austria have been very active in this space, but we are seeing now in the UK trials of this technology on the UK rail system. Next slide, please. And finally, I think the area of heavy duty vehicles and long distance vehicles, where the amount of energy we need to carry on the vehicle is much greater than a light duty car or van, really gives hydrogen fuel cells an opportunity. The bottom picture there is a vehicle produced by JCB as a prototype hydrogen fuel cell powered excavator. And there are a whole range of interests of companies producing heavy duty vehicles like trucks using this technology. Next slide, please. And so now I want to move on to heat and power. Thank you. I want to show this slide. It comes from our Sustainable Gas Institute. And the picture I want to take out from it is the figure on the left there, which shows the percentage of households, buildings, homes connected to the gas network. In this case, it's a natural gas network. And you see the UK has the highest penetration, second highest penetration in the world in terms of the use of natural gas for heating our homes. And we cannot continue to do this in a low carbon society. Moving to electric heat pumps, of course, is one option, but there is also a lot of interest in displacing that natural gas pipelines with a hydrogen pipeline for heat. Next slide, please. So this is a UK company that I will declare an interest in, as I'm one of the founders of this company. And this is a solid oxide fuel cell company called Ceres Power. It's based in the UK. And they've been developing this fuel cell that's shown in the bottom right there, that is very well placed to produce both heat and power at a household scale or at the level of an individual building with high efficiency. If we're putting in natural gas, and this system will run on natural gas, it's a more efficient way of producing heat and power than today's energy system. If we put in hydrogen, then it does that also with no emissions. Next slide, please. And the company is applying this technology. Bosch have taken a stake. It's being developed and applied in buses in China, in marine applications in Korea. And indeed, you can buy units now in Japan for commercial buildings which have this technology inside it for producing heat and power. Next slide. I want to move now on to the role of hydrogen as an energy balancing mechanism. Next slide, please. In a country like the UK, which has an excellent wind resource, it's very likely that a lot of our renewable power will be produced by wind. But there's a well-known issue in Northern Europe with lows in wind supply, particularly in around this time of year, actually, in winter, when, of course, our demand for heat and power is at its height. This is a study by colleagues at Imperial College of the amount of hydrogen storage we would need to deal with a prolonged low in wind in a world in which the UK was reliant on that wind for its primary power production. And the figure on the bottom there shows the number of weeks of low wind. And if we might look at, say, somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks low, we may well need something like 20 to 40 terawatt hours of storage in reserve to meet that low. Next slide, please. So this is the largest pumped hydro station in the UK. We don't have many. It's to Norway in Wales. It has a 9.1 gigawatt hours of storage. To deliver that level of terawatt hours, we would need, for example, for 33 terawatt hours of energy storage, 3,600 of these facilities, which are just not credible. Whereas if we could store 1 million tons of hydrogen, then we would deliver that level of energy storage. Next slide, please. So this is some work from a German group who've done a really good study. I think it's very helpful, looking at the potential for long-term energy storage using hydrogen in Europe. In this case, storing hydrogen in the subsurface in solution mine salt caverns. And whilst this sounds perhaps a bit science fiction, it's actually already done. It's done commercially in both the UK and in North America, for example, for other reasons. And this work shows that Europe has more than enough capacity for its long-term energy storage needs using hydrogen in solution mine salt caverns. Not uniformly distributed around Europe, but in those parts of Europe where it exists. We're fortunate in the UK that we have that capacity. Next slide, please. Finally, just to touch on industrial decarbonisation. Next slide, please. We mustn't forget that decarbonising heavy industry is a really big challenge. There's a lot of work going on around the world now to think about how we make low-cost green hydrogen and also low-cost green ammonia. Sorry for the overlap there on the picture at the bottom, but for example, how you decarbonise steel making and moving away from blast furnaces and carbonaceous processes to a process in which we use hydrogen as the reducing agent to produce our steel is a really important and perhaps exciting prospect. And the ability to produce green hydrogen to decarbonise steel making, I think, is a very important application area, but also ammonia synthesis and other industrial and chemical processes. Next slide, please. So I've used my time up. I'll just close here by what I hope I've whistle-stopped through is the role of zero to low carbon molecules alongside zero to low carbon electrons will be necessary to decarbonise all sectors of the economy. Hydrogen and indeed its carriers such as ammonia are leading options for this. Of course, there are growing international commitments to this, which is great to see. But it's not only about making hydrogen, it's about distributing, storing and using hydrogen in the most efficient way. And at least from a UK perspective, I think I would argue that we have a great science base here. We have some highly innovative companies in the sector who are doing a great job and some good examples of early adoption that I know you all also heard of today. So with that, I'll close. Last slide, please, I think. Yeah. If anyone has interest in this and wants to pick up any more points, feel free to look at those links, and I'll close there. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, or it's afternoon in the UK anyway. I'm Stefan Eldred from KTN. So thanks, Nigel, for that very detailed and comprehensive overview. I suppose I'm going to talk a little bit less away from the tech and the options, and more about innovation and how it's key and how we and others can help. KTN are a UK based, but both myself and my colleagues do have sort of far-reaching Europe and beyond remit, and specifically particularly focused on things like Horizon Europe at the moment. So in our experience, innovation rarely just happens. I mean, we could have a number of names on this slide, to be honest, but it's the key word there is collaboration and coordinated. So it's a consequence of that coordination, and often that is between business with that research support and that government support, and that's in particular where Innovate UK KTN come into this and where we play a part. And I think events like today just highlight that more and more, really, which is to see what's going on across countries, across Europe, across the world, and to understand where those collaboration opportunities are or where the need is. So we're all about connecting for positive change. I don't want to go through things word for word. The key bit for me is about real world solutions. So most of us in KTN have a practical background. I used to be energy manager for a large industrial, and what we want is to help people with opportunities and turn them into those real world solutions, and help people on that journey. We're a network partner of Innovate UK, so a lot of people get confused, and I've got another slide in a minute. But yeah, we're very close to Innovate UK. We're our own organisation, but we're all about the networking within that. So we have a huge amount of expertise in KTN, but what we hope to do is combine the expertise across the economy, UK and Europe, and hopefully lead to collaborations, whether that's for funding, whether that's for events, or just to, as I said, to get those real world solutions off the ground. So yeah, in the UK, we have BEIS, so Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and UK Research and Innovation fits within that. So I suppose Innovate UK, who you can see next along there, are often responsible for the funds within that. So and there's a whole energy team and a whole hydrogen team within that, and then KTN further along. So Innovate UK, KTN, we are often referred to as the UK's innovation network. So we're all about the network within that and connecting people, just to see where we fit in there. We're well connected. I'm guessing these slides will get shared afterwards, so I won't read all the numbers out. But the point is, we've got a huge number of connections in the UK and beyond, and across myself and my 200 colleagues. It's rare that there's if a question or a demand for a certain type of individual or organisation comes up, if one of us doesn't know, somebody else will. So we're always happy to help people to identify where they're best to go with their inquiry, whatever that might be, and hopefully drive those collaborations. So what do we look like on a day-to-day basis? What are we actually on about? I've talked a lot about connecting, so whether that's supply chain knowledge, challenges, finding partners, ultimately, I suppose, as it says at the top. Funding's an interesting one. People often come to us thinking we have that funding. We don't, but we have quite a good handle on what is out there, and what's relevant to whatever challenge you're facing at that time or the organisation is facing. And that's not just government calls, government funding. That's also just a handle on what private investment is out there, and also just being quite honest sometimes. Sometimes we get inquiries where there isn't currently funding, but actually come back to that connecting piece. We might be able to put you in touch with a larger organisation that would still like to work with you on something and get a project going. Based on what a lot of us do, we usually are fairly well engaged with the government organisations and a bit wider, lots of the trade bodies and trade associations. So again, we like to think that we're connected enough to have some influence, or at least understand what's going on as soon as it does. The supporting the business support there, really. So yeah, we're here to help people for the good of net zero primarily, and the good of UK and European economy. And then the navigation one is just interesting. There's across Europe, obviously, there's so much going on as represented today, and we just hope that if people come to us, we can give them a little bit of guidance as to where to turn, where to go within that. So I lead on something called the Hydrogen Innovation Network at KTN, and this is something which is funded by Innovate UK. It was launched formally at the start of 2021, although we did a little bit of pre-work before that, and we spent quite a lot of time understanding what the focus of this network should be. We started off thinking it was around the sort of green hydrogen production, but the more we kind of spoke to people, trade associations, etc., we felt that there was a little bit of a gap of how it's this chicken and egg that's been talked about throughout today. So it's, if we produce it, great, but how is it going to be used and where is it going to be used? And so there's a lot of industrials, people like my previous company, who want to implement hydrogen at scale, but are still finding their feet and understanding how. So we're hoping to just help with that with a non-competitive group. I think also what's been talked about a lot today is green and blue and other colours. we've used the word clean there, I beg your pardon, a slip up there. We've used the word clean there, but I think in KTM we're very focused on green. So we talk a lot about the need, frankly, just to get hydrogen moving and just to get it out there. And we recognise, like the UK government's twin track approach, and we recognise that right now, in terms of the most economic solution, a lot of that is blue. But we want to make sure, or be part of making sure, that green does follow up as soon as possible, rather than us ending up in a situation where many years down the line we're still reliant on the blue. Okay. So as I said, really about that end use side. So this is there'll be lots that people say is missing out of this, but as a kind of a landscape and a focus. You've got your production. We won't go into the colours now. We've got transport and storage, and we've got that demand and that use. And I think we're kind of focused in the bottom right hand corner. I mean, perhaps up a little bit, so perhaps I should have included industrial processes in there a little bit. And we do jump around because we recognise it's a busy space at the moment, and we like to get involved and support where we can. But yeah, it's kind of that use. That's where we kind of focus. Again, you can pick this up on our website, but we've jumped around all over the side. We're involved in a few universities, and we're involved in a few pitch days and sit on the panels for those. We've worked extensively with an organisation in the UK called the Henry Royce Institute, as has, I think, our first speaker today, Hannah, and helping them with their end-to-end materials for hydrogen work. We've got quite close links with Canada, and I'll come on to that in a minute, because I appreciate Canada isn't quite within the remit of what we're talking about today, but we see a lot of wider interest in that. And again, a lot of people have talked about perhaps off-highway, and people have talked about buses and transport and what have you. So yeah, we're involved across the piece. Just on that this is kind of a slightly shameless plug, but next week we've got blending has come up today, and about the need to replace, or at least start to transition from natural gas. And we've got UK, Canada, US webinar next week. Now, we ran this last year as well, and actually when I look at the attendees, there were quite a lot from the sort of regions that we're talking about today and people that are involved today. So it's not just Canada. We put perspective out there. So, hydrogen strategy in the UK has been mentioned a lot today, which we support. As I say, we support that twin track. We probably would like more focus on the green side. But again, we like to put our perspectives out there, and various articles on, things that we've done. Interestingly, again today, a few people have mentioned about where it's best used, hydrogen. Where do you get the best value, the best decarbonisation? And we have a sister innovation network, which is actually cross-sector battery systems. And between us, we very much recognise that there are places for both of these technologies and both of these solutions, and also there's overlap and off-highway, for example. So sort of construction, plant, defence, agri is one of those areas where they sort of need to work in harmony, really. And even the same in buses has come up quite a lot today. It depends on the use case. If you're in a very mountainous environment, then you might need a blend of that hydrogen and battery going forwards. We are just in the process of recording a podcast, which is a bit of a back to basics view, really, hydro generally. So we started off about the colours of hydrogen. We've got some great guests on, and just been talking about where it's best used. So look out for that. And then really, it's not the best pictorial slide, I admit, but so the network, there's about over 2,200 members. Yes, largely focused across the UK because that's where we're based, but does go across Europe, the US, Canada, and across the world. So the network is far-reaching, and again, as demonstrated by today, that's the hydrogen community is far-reaching, and so that's very necessary. But also just on funding, I mean, I haven't listed specific hydrogen funds here because it's forever changing, and across the countries that are represented that will change. But there's a lot going on, and I think the key to people that are developing and looking for funding is that these funds don't always have hydrogen in the title. So, you know, in the UK, we have something called the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, and that can very much include decarbonisation projects involving hydrogen, for example. I know in Europe we've got the Clean Hydrogen Partnership launched late last year. I believe, I'm sure some people on this call probably know more than me, but I believe we're still waiting for the first calls and the first round of calls on that. We're also eagerly awaiting something in the UK called the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, which we're hoping will support the deployment of clean hydrogen production. So we're looking out for that any day now, and that fits within the sort of wider BEIS Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy 1 billion fund on net zero innovation. So I think my point was just that there is funding out there, there's support out there. You know, we can help, as can a lot of other people on this event today. But yeah, there is support out there for people who need it and are looking for it. So that's it for me. I just wanted to leave you on the thought, really, that clean hydrogen development is about more than technology development. Okay, it's clearly that collaboration. There's a lot of people out there with great technologies and great solutions, but to get them, you know, upscaled, to get them into place, to get them into practice, you know, we need that collaboration. So an event like today is fantastic for that. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is so good to talk about hydrogen today, which we see that this is a topic that unites us not only in UK, Baltic states and Scandinavia, but we see that all over the world, this is the topic that unites everybody. And everybody is very curious and excited to learn what are the challenges, what are the opportunities. And today we have the last session, the last panel discussion on the topic how hydrogen in the transition to carbon neutrality, how it can unlock hydrogen potential as a low carbon alternative. We have a slight change in our agenda. I will be a moderator today. My name is Jurgita Širinskaitė-Venslovienė. I'm head of LNG commerce at Klaipėdos Nafta, which is LNG and oil terminal operator in Lithuania. And together with me are two wonderful panelists. One is Jukka Rosanen, Head of Business Development, Renewable Hydrogen and Power to Gas at Neste from Finland. And Björn Aronsson, Managing Director at Hydrogen Sweden. So good afternoon, dear colleagues.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It will be very interesting as I will be a panelist and moderator at the same time, but I hope we can manage to cope. So colleagues, first of all, I would like to address to you. Maybe we could touch upon the situation in your respective countries. What is the specific situation with hydrogen? How passionate is the situation? And from your own company perspective, what is the target in your companies? So if you could elaborate for 2 or 3 minutes. So first of all, maybe Mr. Jukka, please.
Thank you very much, Jurgita. First of all, maybe I could start from the national perspective of hydrogen. Maybe summarizing it into 3 parts. So first one is the need for an ambitious national vision for valorizing cost competitive renewable electricity is needed. And what I mean by this national vision is not only kind of vision or setting targets for specific gigawatts of electrolyzers and hydrogen in terms of volumes as a kind of bulk producer, but I mean more as a national strategy on achieving products which have a higher value added in the needs of meeting the needs of society. And in Finland we have already, this is the second point, we have quite a good electricity infrastructure. It's in good shape. We have one price zone from Lapland to south of Finland, where I am today. And the electricity transmission is in good shape, but it needs investments and it needs support. And this being able to leverage this, what is today relatively cost competitive electricity, requires kind of further investments in order to ensure that the costs remain low and that there is a future scalability also. And in achieving this, permitting is in a pivotal role to ensure that the time and the costs kind of remain at the right level. And the third point is that, well, hydrogen is not hydrogen only. We need to convert that to have an offering for the society. This can be made from CO2 and hydrogen, well, the plastic parts of this. But we need research and development to support the development of these new synthesis routes, new products, and new technology solutions. Yeah, and I think those are the three national points that I wanted to raise up. In terms of our company, so I work at Neste. I graduated from Sweden, from Chalmers, and I work at Neste now. This is my 5th year here, and my role is to develop new offering on new products and new technologies for renewable hydrogen PTX. We have a team, and our company's approach is that we invest in new feedstocks in order to kind of have scalable avenues for the future. And today, our company Neste, we are a global leader in renewable fuels and chemicals, and we have oil-based products production here in Finland as well. And we aim to grow to a global leader in renewable and sustainable solutions. A PTX, renewable hydrogen, they fit into this picture very well, and both are scalable feedstocks, and that's why we have set up what we call business platforms for developing these avenues forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Juka. So maybe I could address with the same question to Mr. Bjorn. Could you elaborate on the national perspective and your own organization perspective?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting us here. Yes, we are the National Organization for Hydrogen Technologies, and we are now 15 years old as an organization. So we've been around for a while. Today we have around 115 members. That's from the business sector, from the academia, and also from the public sector. And we think this mix is excellent to have now, because when new technologies should enter the market, it's a combination of cooperation between all of those different categories of members. So we were very happy last year because we got 2 hydrogen strategies, national strategies on the table. One in January from a group that was appointed by the government. It's called Fossilfritt Sverige, the Fossil-Free Sweden. And they had been working with 22 roadmaps for different sectors, how to be fossil-free. But the result of those studies was very interesting because they got the business sector to work together to create a roadmap. But they also pointed to use the same energy need, the same energy carrier, or so it was really overbooked different energy sources. When the hydrogen strategy came in, it was cross-sectorial. And this was the benefit because then we could actually release some of the energy needed for some sectors where they could only use, for example, biomethane. Then hydrogen could be an example, and that could take over that. And for a total view of the country, this was a benefit then. It was then easier to reach the target. So in that strategy, we saw that it was appointed 5 different nodes or H2 hubs. That is most likely the areas where there will be more condensed use of hydrogen in the industry sector. Then in November, we got the official hydrogen strategy proposal from the Energy Agency of Sweden. And that was delivered to the government. So that is now on the table of the government for decisions how to take the next steps. And this was also a good step forward where we had some objectives that was set up. And that was, for example, for the installation of electrolyzers. So 3 gigawatts of electrolyzer until 2030 and 8 gigawatts until 2045. Now we could already see now a few months later that this is way too low. This will not meet the requirements from the industry. So there will be higher figures. But anyway, it's a good ambition. We see that the steel industry is moving forward to the green steel. This has a big influence on getting hydrogen on top of the agenda in the country. And the big CO2 emissions that we can reduce, it's around 7 to 10% of the country's CO2 emissions that can be reduced by using hydrogen only in the steel sector. So this is a great step forward. What we see now is that hydrogen will not be only for one sector. The sectoral integration is really the key word. That's something we need to work with. And that is where we will probably find the best business cases when different sectors can cooperate. And finally, one last very interesting milestone that we met here only a few weeks ago was that we have now a hydrogen storage in a schoolyard. There was a preschool being built from Basic. So it was inaugurated a few days ago, and it has a hydrogen storage in the schoolyard approved by the Swedish authorities. This is a very good step in getting hydrogen out in society, making it in a safe way so people can live and work and be around hydrogen in a good way forward. So that was a quick summary of the status in Sweden at the moment.
Thank you very much. So I will share a few words from the perspective of Lithuania. You just mentioned that Sweden has prepared 2 strategies for hydrogen. The recent 2 years, probably almost all EU countries and neighboring countries have prepared their strategies if they didn't have yet. So Lithuania is one of the countries that is preparing the strategy as well right now, the roadmap for hydrogen development in Lithuania. And we expect in probably April, latest in May, to see the finalized version that would answer the most important question. Will Lithuania be an importer of hydrogen, or will Lithuania become an exporter of hydrogen, or will it be a net consumption, meaning that you produce as much as you consume yourself? But Lithuania is in a position where we have quite good situation and possibilities to produce green energy, green electricity, which opens up new possibilities to be one of the producers of hydrogen. But at the same time, we in Lithuania are looking at the context that there is so much uncertainty related to hydrogen, and at the same time risk. And the uncertainty is in the technology, meaning that there are solutions like, of course, we are prioritizing green hydrogen produced from water with electrolyzers. But even if we look at these technologies, actually, I guess every week we can hear that there is a new technology to produce hydrogen. It's alkaline, it's PEM, but now we hear about new membranes used potentially that potentially will be even more efficient. Some technologies are without membrane and etc. Also, there are considerations to produce green hydrogen from biomass using steam methane reforming or gasification technologies from biomethane and pyrolysis. So there are so many technologies in place, but and there's at the same time uncertainty which technology will take place. So this is something which makes it exciting, but at the same time complicated. So on the other hand, for sure, it is seen that hydrogen is an opportunity to be energy independent. At least in Lithuania, this topic, especially currently when we talk about this geopolitical situation in regards to the natural gas market, to the supplies, energy independence is important more than ever. and renewable energy and hydrogen is seen as potential, but along with all the challenges that we need to compete to go along. So from the attitude of our specific company, Klaipėdos Nafta, we are an LNG terminal operator and oil terminal operator, as I mentioned. So potentially we see that we will need to wait for a bit until there will be decent quantities of hydrogen to be transferred in the specific terminals. But nevertheless, so I will go to the question to you colleagues. In the process of decarbonization, the companies and industries and countries in general have different alternatives. Hydrogen is not the only one. First of all, quite often I hear a question: why do we produce hydrogen if we can use electricity itself? Is it the most efficient way to produce hydrogen? And if not hydrogen, Mr. Yuka, maybe ammonia, maybe methanol, maybe something else. This is your specialty. So first of all, I would like to address you. How do you think, how can hydrogen and which specific technology could be most competing in other alternatives on the way to decarbonization? What to choose and how to argument?
Oh my, Jyrkita, please call me Jukka, first of all.
Jukka, thank you.
Yeah. If we look at hydrogen production today, depends on how you measure it. It's about 70, 80 million tons, up to 100 million tons, all fossil, all coming from, apart from small deviations, and all coming, majority coming from natural gas production. So clearly in terms of the volume and the energy consumed, which is fossil energy consumed to produce that hydrogen, it's a good place to start. Hydrogen is embodied in all the products we consume today, almost from margarine to steel, and going for greener hydrogen is a very good point to start, because not only you can produce the hydrogen from renewable energy sources, you can already today stop emitting. You can do carbon capture for your hydrogen production units, continue with the rest of your production to serve the society, and thus reduce your emissions. So I think there's, in terms of hydrogen, there's a great potential in terms of, well, for the products that the society needs. That's why it totally makes sense. Hydrogen is described as an energy carrier for the energy sector to a large degree, but I like to also emphasize that it's used for material needs in great quantities today, and that's a great point to start as well. In terms of decarbonizing our society, there are many different ways. For example, renewable diesel, which we offer, is a kind of a fast and efficient way of utilizing the existing infrastructure to reduce up to 90% of your emissions from your vehicle. And that's then one way of achieving GHG reduction. But as you point out, there is the whole bandwidth of different solutions, and we believe that you need the whole bandwidth of solutions. Direct electrification is very efficient for many applications, maybe in the road transportation, for example, in heating and so forth. And there's many places where it makes totally sense. But then there are kind of utilization, well, for example, this mouse and the plastic within it, the planes in the sky, where you need to have the energy stored or the material in the form where you have a hydrocarbon that has specific properties. And in that hydrocarbon, you need the carbon source, but you need the hydrogen as well. And again, it comes to the question that, well, how do you produce this? How do you capture carbon? And how do you produce hydrogen? Then you come back to the green hydrogen and other clean hydrogen opportunities. So regardless of the application, I think hydrogen has significant opportunities, and that's why there's a good reason for such a raised attention towards hydrogen at the moment. But in the bigger picture, it's one solution, especially if we talk about mobility, for example. There is lignocellulosics, municipal solid waste, different agricultural wastes, algae in the future, CO2-based products. There's a bandwidth of carbon sources, bandwidth of solutions that can be developed and need to be developed. Hydrogen alone or electrification alone will not be enough to meet the demands of the society.
Yes, thank you. And what is your opinion, Bjorn?
Yes, I like what Jukka said here, and we must never let the number of choices be an excuse of not doing anything, or not taking a step into reduce the greenhouse gases. And this is very much of the discussion today. It's so polarized, so you have to be pro or against hydrogen or electricity or whatever. In many of the cases, electricity is the most efficient one if you need electricity or an electrical drivetrain or whatever. But in the cases when you need hydrogen for a process, then you can't use electricity, then you need hydrogen, and then it's not a question about efficiency anymore. So it's all depending on the application, what you really need. And we should actually be happy that we have so many different choices. We have batteries, we have hydrogen, we have biofuels, and we will have the supercapacitors that will also play a role. And the combination of those, that is the key. The more I learn about it, the less I see actually the big competition between the choices. I see complement, synergies. And I think that is really a step forward. And then as the market will evolve and the technology development will go further, we will see higher volumes of all the including components and systems. Then the price will come also to a level where you can see more different applications on the market. Yeah, I think that is more the key. The more the merrier. we need them all, and they will find their unique position. But don't hesitate, act.
But anyway, if you are a company, you see so many alternatives, and you always count. Of course, you would like to make the decision on the technology that would be worldwide proven, and for sure you would be in a good position. So, how to make a decision that why should they choose hydrogen instead of biomethane?
Well, a company makes the decision based on what stays under the bottom line, so that kind of helps in the decision making. Of course, you need to evaluate these different routes, but then in terms of where I work now is business platform, which is kind of developing the future bottom line for a company. So we try to understand this competitiveness of different technologies by studying them. For example, in Rotterdam, we are piloting this novel type of solid oxide electrolyzer, which is a high temperature electrolyzer. We are today actually, we have concrete on the ground, so the project works are ongoing. But the second step is then we are studying larger scale electrolysis based hydrogen for Porvoo, which is a refinery here in South Finland, and also carbon capture for producing blue. So we are studying two different types of approaches. First one is the smaller scale novel technology might break through, has a kind of high future potential for different things. And the other one is then looking at, okay, in the large scale, how can we fast reduce our emissions coming from hydrogen? Well, that's carbon capture for our existing steam methane reformer, and that will create blue hydrogen. And then in large scale, how can we produce green hydrogen in an industrial setup? And then the financials come into play. It all needs to make financially sense. And that's then a kind of combination of creating understanding of the technology choices, different vendors. It's a heated market, the supply scenario, and then creating the business case for the end products which you utilize the hydrogen for. An important element, if I may add, to the hydrogen business development is the regulative landscape. Of course, today natural gas prices are pretty unnormal, but in a normal scenario, green hydrogen is more expensive than fossil, for example. And in that scenario, you need regulative support to support the development of the end market. And as an example, in Europe, as a part of the Fit for 55 package, there is the prerequisite or this kind of a demand proposed that 50% of hydrogen, which is produced for use in Europe, is to be of renewable fuel of non-biogenic origin. So it would mean that 50% of hydrogen, which is used for producing products in Europe in 2030, would need to come from, well, electrolyzers. And these type of regulations are required to drive the industry forwards. This is the stick, but then you need also the carrot for the regulative parts and to promote then the development of these markets.
Yes, that's totally correct. And Björn, I would like to refer to at one thing that you have mentioned, that in Sweden you have prepared cross-sectoral analysis and strategy, and this is a very interesting solution. Could you share with other listeners, with other countries, how you managed to reach such a result, and what would you recommend for other countries also to keep in mind when preparing their strategies and analyzing the resources which are limited?
Well, we don't yet have the results from these studies. It was on the action plan in the strategies that we need to look into this area as a cross-sectorial view, actually. But one very simple example is if, for example, now a big heavy industry, they need a lot of green hydrogen. So they need to set up a big plant producing green hydrogen. To secure the production, they need a hydrogen storage. Could be a few days up to 2 weeks of hydrogen storage to be able to always keep the production running. To be able to create so much hydrogen, you need a very good energy system. It might be a wind power plant, or you have clean electricity from the grid, so you take hydropower or whatever. There you have a combination of the industry need and the energy sector's need. Once you then have produced so much hydrogen to a good price, hopefully a good price, of course, also the company, they need to move their product to the next customer in line. And that could be rather far away. If you should run with a long-haul truck for 1,000 kilometers, it's excellent then to fill up the car with good priced green hydrogen and drive the product to a customer. So immediately we have incorporated transport sector, industry sector, and energy sector. And we have also created a hydrogen storage that would actually act as a backup storage system also for the city nearby, or the municipality where this industry is acting. So immediately we see that we have so big cooperation possibilities just around an energy carrier that can solve several different problems in society, including the greenhouse gas emission reduction.
I'd like to share one thing as well, because from a perspective that you mentioned, it's important to look at all the sectors simultaneously: transport, industry, energy, and all the consumption. Currently, I observe that almost in all the countries, the value chains are very fragmented. For example, in some locations that we have working value chain only in transport sector, let's say fueling station, some vehicles that are using hydrogen. In some other locations, we have industrial users that are usually producing and consuming hydrogen locally at that same location. In best case, there is some pipeline between production site and the consumption side, but one pipeline direct and not a network. So we do not have network yet. though, of course, there is a wonderful map of hydrogen backbone, which foresees that flows of hydrogen will be going by 2040. But anyway, currently it's very fragmented. Do you have any tips how to merge these fragmented small value chains that a bigger scale would be increasing in all the countries, in locally as well, and on the international level? Bjorn, Jukka?
Can I start? Okay. Yeah, it's a very good question, because you mentioned in the beginning of our talk here about the different technologies that enter the market, and it's very confusing for the reader to understand, oh, is this mature? Can I buy this tomorrow or whatever? So what we need to add to that communication is to more use the TRL scale, the technology readiness level. If this was added, then the reader could understand, oh, this is ready tomorrow, or this is ready in 10 years. That would be easier. But it's not so much about technology readiness. It's about the business model and the business case and the business model. And one simple answer to your question is cooperation. But maybe this cooperation has to be in a new setup, because I can see that hydrogen will fit in the value chains we have today. In some cases, we can just swap from gray to green and it will be the same value chain, probably. But there will be a number of new value chains that we need to build up from the beginning. And we don't really know who to start doing that with. And this is a big opportunity to actually be having the opportunity, the chance to build a new value chain. And then we can also make it in a fair way, because today some value chains, they are very unfair. Some get a lot of the profit, take a lot of the risk. Some and the other way, that some take a high risk and get very little. Now, creating this value chain from the beginning, you can settle the rules that, hey, we want to share the risk together and we also share the profit. And we can also cut the value chain so there will not be too many chains taking part of the profit, so the end product will be too expensive for the customer. So there are many of those cases and factors on the table, and I think we have to start thinking new. We can see that from new technologies entering the market, and especially new companies entering the market, they have a totally new view of the business model. So there will be completely new value chains. And I think every sector needs to look into this and understand what will be the influence for me. Because as Jukka said earlier, in 2030, there will be requirements saying that my model, my product is probably not anymore wanted on the market. And I need to invest now. So you need to understand both what is coming on the regulatory sector arena, and also how can we build the new business models.
Yes, thank you. And do you think that regulation and standardization could help this process? Because also one of the challenges that we observe that starting from different connections once you want to fuel or in security standards as well, it is pretty underdeveloped. Would you see any opportunities to work on this scale?
You're asking me again?
You and Jukka, if both of you can contribute to the same question.
We have some regulations that are global, and as you see the car behind me, this is an old picture. This is from 2014, and I mean, must say we are very lucky that the interface between the car and the refueling station has been a global standard for many years, over 10 years, and this is a fantastic, great global cooperation leading to that. So this is something we need to do in more sectors. And in the sectors where it's global, that's very complex. Then you can't create your own standard in your own country and environment. You need to work global for this. So that takes longer time, and there will always be a competitor who has another view. And so this is big diplomatic work and create a win-win. There will be other regulations coming, as Jukka said, where there will be required to make a safe installation. You need to fulfill this and this and this. And that's why I mentioned this hydrogen storage in this schoolyard, because that was 4 years heavy work from a company to achieve an approved permission to store the hydrogen in a safe way. But every one of those installations that are some of the first ones leads to further possibilities to build this in a safe way in the sector. And we are lacking. I mean, we have regulations within the industry because you have skilled people with experience working with gas, different sectors where you use hydrogen. The challenge is when we use hydrogen in society now, where everyone gets closer to hydrogen. It is not more dangerous than batteries or gasoline or diesel or whatever. If you make a complete risk analysis, it's not more dangerous. But there are new risks and they are different. And that's why you need to educate people how to use it and make it foolproof so it will be very safe to have. And there we need a lot of work. That's true. But that has already started in several sectors.
Jukka, Nesta, you have extensive experience of handling hydrogen because you use hydrogen in your technological processes. So is standardization and regulation observed as an issue, of course, on an industrial level, probably not always, but in general, in mass usage of hydrogen? How do you see it from your perspective?
Well, absolutely. I think hydrogen safety is also a national issue, and as Björn also raised through standardization, it's across national, it's a EU-wide global topic, and where standardization plays a very important role. And I would even kind of dare to say that despite our kind of decades-long use of hydrogen, we have also a lot to develop in terms of understanding hydrogen safety when it is produced in different ways, when it is compressed into different pressures than how we use it, and also when it's used in different ways than we use it today, being transported maybe for hydrogen refueling stations utilized by people that might not have the similar type of training as refining operators. So between us knowing what we know today and how hydrogen will be utilized in the 2030s, there's a huge gap in the hydrogen safety standardification of that value chain. And when you asked about this, this fragmentation of value chains, that's kind of evident, and we need to work together with different companies to not only develop the solutions that we can have here and you can have there, but that we have kind of a shared understanding of where the industry is going, that we develop solutions that are then also future-proofed to some extent. For example, is it liquid hydrogen that will be utilized, or is it 700 bar, 350 bar? That we have solutions developed that then kind of sustain the test of time. If they need to make financially sense as well, and therefore as future-proof as they are, the better they are for test kind of sustaining that test as well. But I don't. It's not only about our company. It's about the global standardification. Maybe luckily there has been front-runner companies that have been developing this, and there are already solutions that can be delivered, for example, for hydrogen refueling, which meet very strict kind of demands in terms of safety and our safety use. And but the work is by far done. There's a long way to go.
Yes, indeed, long way to go. And I see that our interesting discussion and insightful discussion is going to an end. So could I ask you to share your last ideas? So let's assume that we are able to address the policymakers on national, international level. So what could you give as recommendations for them? What is needed for hydrogen to be the first option in the nearest future on the way to the decarbonizations. What they could do, how they could contribute, that this for industries, for the businesses, this could be a viable solution. 1 or 2 tips?
Well, I guess support the infrastructure development, ensure that the permitting process are fast. We need gigawatts of wind projects, ensure that the grid is in good conditions, and that also for the hydrogen utilization, the infrastructure for the value chain is supported. It is needed in the first phases, and once you have the production, the utilization ramped up, it will become self-sustainable. We are not there, but for this infrastructure.
Thank you.
Yeah, we need to scale up, so we must not be afraid of setting targets with numbers. I'm lacking that, and we see competition from other parts of the world where they are very good in setting these targets, and that is something I see lacking in our part of the world. So we need to set concrete targets and make a plan towards that. And then education. We need education, and especially for the politicians and the authorities. And I'm happy to see the big steps being taken in a short while, but we also need to dare to make the wider system approach, to make the wider system analysis. They are far too narrow today, so we miss the good solutions and the synergies. Make them even wider, and don't be afraid, and there you will find the key for a better solution.
Yeah, thank you. So I will try to conclude our discussion, what we have discussed, and from what we have heard today in this event, that there are so many technologies to produce hydrogen. There are so many colors attached to hydrogen production, but of course the ones that are leading to decarbonization, that means with carbon capture and storage solutions, green hydrogen production with electrolyzers or alternative solutions, is the most wanted in our decarbonization way. And for the companies to proceed on this way, it is important to, as I understand, not to be afraid to take the first steps, to choose one of the technologies that are available or are seen to be promising on decarbonization. And at the same time, if we would like to choose the technology, some incentives should be in place, as Jukka said, like stick and a carrot that could foster us to go there. And I think on one hand, this stick and carrot is already in place, as mentioned, the Fit for 55, the requirement to have 50% of renewable green alternatives to be in place when producing hydrogen in some of the industries. And on the other hand, some of the financial instruments are also in place. Will it be enough? That's a question. Probably it will not be enough, but it's important that the beginning is here. And also from policy side, regulation, standardization are very important, that we would be talking on the same language, in the same language, meaning technological language in this case. But I would like to sum up all in all, that if we see that the hydrogen in the nearest perspective could be an option, it is very important cooperation. And thanks to this wonderful event organized by the British Embassy, we are pleased that we can start sharing our experiences, and I'm pretty sure that further cooperation results will be in place. So thank you very much for attending this panel, Jukka and Bjorn.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for all the ones who were watching this conference. Thank you very much.